What if everything we thought we knew about our ancestors was wrong? Beneath shifting desert sands, deep within tangled jungle ruins, and carved into stones older than recorded memory, lie objects that defy explanation. Megalithic structures aligned with impossible precision. Maps depicting coastlines no living eye should have seen. Artifacts whose purpose still baffles the sharpest minds of our age. Who built them? How? And what knowledge died with them? Tonight, we journey across forgotten continents, from the Andes to the deserts of Egypt, chasing whispers history tried to bury. So dim the lights, settle in, and let's descend into the unknown. The Aegean Sea, spring of 1901. Off the rocky coast of a small Greek island called Antikythera, sponge divers descend into the cold blue, searching the seabed for their daily catch. Instead, they find a graveyard. The shattered hull of an ancient Roman-era ship lies broken across the ocean floor, scattered with bronze statues, amphorae, and the bones of a long-forgotten crew. The wreck is dated to roughly the 1st century BC. Among the corroded relics raised to the surface is an unremarkable lump of bronze and wood, encrusted with 2,000 years of marine sediment. No one pays it much attention. It would sit, ignored, in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens for decades. Then, in 1902, an archaeologist named Valerios Stace noticed something strange. A gear wheel embedded in the corroded mass. A perfectly machined gear, with finely cut teeth, locked inside an object that should not have contained anything of the sort. What followed would unravel one of the most haunting puzzles in the history of science. Today, we know it as the Antikythera mechanism, and by every conventional understanding of ancient technology, it should not exist. X-ray and CT scans performed over the last several decades have revealed an interior of staggering complexity. At least 30 interlocking bronze gears, dials, pointers, and inscriptions in ancient Greek. It is, in essence, a hand-cranked analog computer. Turn the handle, and the mechanism predicts the positions of the sun and moon, tracks the phases of the lunar cycle, forecasts solar and lunar eclipses decades in advance, and even marks the timing of the ancient Olympic Games. Nothing of comparable sophistication would appear in the historical record for another 1,000 years. Not in Rome, not in Byzantium, not in the great courts of medieval Europe. The next mechanical devices of similar precision emerge only with the astronomical clocks of the 14th century. So how did this exist in the 1st century BC? Mainstream historians point cautiously toward the school of Archimedes, or to the astronomer Hipparchus, who worked on the island of Rhodes around the time the device is believed to have been built. Cicero himself wrote of mechanical spheres that modeled the heavens, devices that, until the discovery at Antikythera, were assumed to be myth or exaggeration. Perhaps then the Greeks possessed an entire tradition of precision engineering, lost to time, and the mechanism is the sole survivor of a vanished craft. But others ask different questions. If such a device existed, where are the others? Where are the workshops, the failed prototypes, the manuals, the apprentices? A technology of this caliber does not appear, fully formed, in a single artifact, and then vanish without a trace. Some researchers have suggested the knowledge came from somewhere older still, an inheritance from a forgotten civilization whose name has slipped beyond memory. Others wonder whether the device was unique, a singular obsession of a singular mind, the way a Stradivarius might survive long after its maker is forgotten. And there are stranger theories yet, theories that cluster at the edges of accepted scholarship, asking whether the ancient world was, in ways we have not yet accepted, far more advanced than we believe. The bronze itself offers no answers. The inscriptions speak of cycles and stars, but not of origins. The hands that shaped it are dust. What else, one wonders, was aboard that ship? What else lies on that seabed unfound? And how many other such objects has the ocean already swallowed, waiting in the dark? The sea, of course, is not the only keeper of secrets. Sometimes the past reveals itself not in the dark of the ocean floor, but in the dry stillness of a forgotten room, beneath the dust of a collapsed palace. And sometimes, what it reveals is not a machine, but a message. A message that, more than a century after its discovery, no one on Earth can read. Travel west across the Aegean to the island of Crete. The year is 1908. An Italian archaeologist named Luigi Pernier is excavating the ruins of Phaistos, a Minoan palace that once stood among the great centers of Bronze Age civilization. The palace had been destroyed, rebuilt, and destroyed again, its halls reduced to weathered foundations baking under the Mediterranean sun. On the 3rd of July, in a small underground chamber within the ruins of the old palace complex, Pernier uncovered something he could not explain. A single disc of fired clay, no larger than the palm of a hand, roughly 6 inches across, unbroken, unweathered, almost untouched by the centuries. Both of its faces were covered, edge to center, in a tightly wound spiral of symbols, not scratched in by hand, but stamped, pressed into the soft clay with individual seals, each symbol struck cleanly into the surface before the disc was fired. 241 impressions in total, 45 distinct signs, human heads wearing strange crests, walking figures, birds, fish, tools, a flowering branch, a shield, a ship. It is the oldest known example of movable type in human history, predating the printing press by nearly 3,000 years. And no one knows what it says. The Phaistos disc, as it came to be known, is dated to roughly the 2nd millennium BC, sometime between 1850 and 1600 BC. It belongs, in theory, to the Minoan civilization that flourished on Crete during the Bronze Age. The people of King Minos, of the Labyrinth, of the bull leapers painted on the frescoes of Knossos. But the writing on the disc resembles no known Minoan script. It is not Linear A. It is not Linear B. It is not Cretan hieroglyphic. It is not Egyptian. It is not Hittite. It bears no clear connection to any writing system known to the ancient Mediterranean world. Not in Greece, not in Egypt, not in the lands stretching from Anatolia down through Palestine and into Mesopotamia. It is, by every available measure, unique. Over the past 120 years, hundreds of attempts have been made to decipher it. Linguists, mathematicians, cryptographers, amateur enthusiasts, and dedicated scholars have all proposed solutions. Some have read it as a prayer to a Minoan goddess, others as a hymn, a calendar, a legal contract, a list of place names, a record of military campaigns. One researcher claimed it was a board game, another a geometric proof. Still others have argued it is written in an early form of Greek, or perhaps in a language related to the ancient peoples of Anatolia. None of these readings has ever been confirmed. The reason is simple and frustrating. The disc is alone. There is no second text, no bilingual inscription, no Rosetta Stone, no scrap of related writing found at any other site. With only 241 symbols to study and no comparison material to test a translation against, decipherment may be mathematically impossible. A code without a key. This, of course, is what mainstream archaeology can tell us. But the Phaistos disc has long invited stranger speculations. Why, for instance, was it stamped, when every other surviving Minoan inscription was scratched freehand into clay or stone? The use of pre-made seals implies that whoever made the disc expected to make more of them. Where then are the others? Why has not a single related artifact ever been found? Not on Crete, not anywhere in the wider Aegean. Was the disc imported from a place we have not yet located? Was it the work of a culture that left no other trace in the archaeological record? Some have suggested it came from Atlantis, the lost civilization described by Plato, sunk beneath the sea in a single night. Others have proposed it is the relic of a vanished island people, swept away by the eruption of Thera around 1600 BC, the volcanic catastrophe that may have ended the Minoan world. A few have argued, more cautiously, that the disc represents a script used only by a small elite, priests perhaps, or a single royal court, and that the rest of its corpus was written on perishable materials and is simply gone, dissolved by time. And then there are the stranger ideas. The notion that the symbols are not language at all, but something else. A star map, an astronomical instrument, an encoded ritual whose meaning was never meant to be read by the uninitiated. The disk has been turned, weighed, scanned, and photographed in extraordinary detail. Every spiral, every impression, every microfracture in its clay has been measured, and still, it does not yield. In a museum in Heraklion, on the island where it was found, the Phaistos disk rests behind glass, lit softly from above. Visitors lean close. They photograph it. They study the strange parade of figures spiraling toward the center, where the message, whatever it is, comes finally to its end. Or its beginning. We cannot even be certain which way it should be read. Somewhere, perhaps, the key still exists, buried beneath another collapsed palace, sealed in another forgotten chamber, waiting, like the disk itself once waited, for a hand to brush away the dust. What was the Maker trying to tell us? And why, after 36 centuries, are we still listening? A message we cannot read. A Maker we cannot name. The Phaistos disk reminds us how easily knowledge slips through the fingers of time. How a civilization can leave behind a single object, a single voice, and then fall silent forever. But what if an entire civilization had done the same? What if, somewhere beneath the soil, there waited not a disk, not a mechanism, but a temple, older than the wheel, older than writing, older than the very idea of the city? Travel east, across the Mediterranean, into the rolling highlands of southeastern Turkey. The land here is harsh and beautiful, a patchwork of stony hills and dry valleys not far from the headwaters of the Euphrates. To the south lies Syria. Further still, the long arc of the ancient Fertile Crescent stretches down through Lebanon and into Palestine, the cradle, as we have long been told, of human civilization. Of farming, of cities, of the slow rise of organized society. But on a low limestone ridge about 10 miles from the city of Şanlıurfa, the soil holds a story that contradicts almost everything we thought we knew. The local people called the place Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill. For centuries, farmers had plowed its slopes, occasionally turning up fragments of carved stone, which they assumed were medieval debris. In 1963, a survey team from the University of Chicago noted the site briefly and moved on. It would take another 3 decades before a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, examining old reports, recognized that the carved fragments were not medieval at all. They were something else entirely. In 1995, Schmidt began to dig. What he uncovered would force the rewriting of human history. Beneath the soil of Göbekli Tepe lay massive circular enclosures, ringed with towering T-shaped pillars of limestone. Some of the pillars stood 18 feet tall and weighed up to 20 tons. They had been carefully quarried, shaped, transported, and arranged into precise geometric patterns. Their flat faces were carved with reliefs of animals: foxes, lions, scorpions, vultures, wild boars, snakes coiling along the stone. Some pillars bore the suggestion of human form: long arms running down the sides, hands meeting at the front, belts and loincloths rendered in low relief. They were not merely stones. They were figures, watchers, presences. And then came the dating. Radiocarbon analysis placed the construction of Göbekli Tepe at approximately 9,600 BC, 11,600 years ago, older than Stonehenge by 7,000 years, older than the pyramids of Giza by 7,000 years, older than the invention of pottery, older than the wheel, older even than agriculture itself. This is the part that does not fit. According to every model of human prehistory taught in universities for the past century, monumental architecture was supposed to come after the rise of farming. Hunter-gatherers, the theory went, lacked the time, the surplus, the social organization to build on such a scale. Cities, temples, and great works of stone were the rewards of the agricultural revolution, not its predecessors. And yet, at Göbekli Tepe, The order is reversed. The temple comes first, the grain comes after. Who built it? The people of this region at this time were nomadic foragers. They left no cities. They left no written records. They left no metal tools, only flint and bone. And yet, somehow, they organized themselves into a workforce of hundreds, perhaps thousands, capable of quarrying multi-ton stones from bedrock, transporting them across rough terrain, and raising them upright in concentric rings, oriented with apparent care toward the night sky. Why did they do it? And why, after using the site for perhaps 2,000 years, did they deliberately bury it? Because that is, perhaps, the strangest detail of all. Göbekli Tepe was not abandoned. It was entombed. Its builders, or their descendants, filled the entire complex with rubble and earth, sealing the pillars beneath an artificial hill. They did this with intention, with effort, with care. And then they walked away, and the place was forgotten for 11,000 years. Mainstream archaeologists offer cautious explanations. The site, they suggest, was a religious sanctuary, perhaps a place where scattered hunter-gatherer bands gathered seasonally to feast, to mourn, to honor the dead, to perform rites whose meaning we will never recover. Some have proposed that the social cooperation required to build it may itself have driven the invention of agriculture, that the temple did not follow the farm, but produced it as a means of feeding the workforce. Others go further. A few researchers have argued that the precision of Göbekli Tepe, its astronomical alignments, its carved reliefs, its sophisticated stoneworking, implies a level of accumulated knowledge that simply could not have been developed by isolated foragers. They suggest the site is the inheritance of an older culture, a forgotten people who survived some great cataclysm at the end of the last ice age and passed their wisdom forward to the hunter-gatherers of the New World. The carvings in this reading are not decoration. They are memory, a record of beasts, of stars, of events we no longer recognize. And there are still stranger interpretations. That the vulture stone, with its peculiar arrangement of symbols, depicts a comet impact. That the entire site was a memorial to a catastrophe. That somewhere beneath the unexcavated portions of the hill, and only a small fraction has been excavated, lies something that has not yet been found. Klaus Schmidt died in 2014. He believed Göbekli Tepe would take another 50 years to fully understand. The work continues. Newer sites, even older still, have begun to emerge from the same region. Karahan Tepe, Sayburç, a whole landscape of stone slowly rising from the dust. What did they know, those people in the long silence before history began? And what, exactly, were they trying to remember? A message we cannot read, a machine we cannot explain, both small enough to hold in the hand. But not all the mysteries of the ancient world are quiet or modest in scale. Some are vast, some are carved into the bones of the earth itself, and some were hidden so completely, for so long, that the people living above them never suspected they were there at all. Travel east, far from the Aegean, to the green hills of Zhejiang province in eastern China. Here, near the small village of Xi'an, the landscape rolls gently. Terraced rice paddies, bamboo groves, slow rivers winding between low mountains. For centuries, the villagers knew of certain ponds scattered across their land. Deep, still pools of dark water, unusually cold even in summer. They called them bottomless. Local tradition held that they had always been there, and that disturbing them would bring misfortune. In June of 1992, a villager named Wu Anai decided to test the legend. With a small group of neighbors and a borrowed water pump, he began draining one of the ponds. They expected a few hours of work. They pumped for 17 days. When the water was finally gone, they did not find a pond at all. They found a room, an enormous hand-carved chamber descending into the earth. Smooth walls, sloping pillars, a vaulted ceiling cut from solid sandstone. The villagers, stunned, drained the next pond, and the next. By the end of the excavation, 24 separate caverns had been uncovered beneath the hills around Xi'an. Together, they form what is now called the Longyu Caves, and almost everything about them defies explanation. Each cave is enormous. The largest covers more than 2,000 square meters. The ceilings rise to 30 meters in height, taller than a 10-story building. The walls slope inward at precise, consistent angles, and every surface, from floor to ceiling, is covered in a strange, uniform pattern of parallel chisel marks. Fine. Regular. Carved with a precision that seems almost mechanical, as if a single artisan had worked every cave with the same hand and the same tool, across hundreds of thousands of square meters of stone. The caves are connected, but not joined. Walls only inches thick separate one chamber from the next, yet none of these walls have ever broken through. Whoever carved them knew exactly where the neighboring cave lay, and stopped just before reaching it. How they knew this, working in torchlit darkness beneath the earth, no one can say. Estimates of the labor involved are staggering. To excavate the volume of stone removed from the Longyu Caves, nearly 1 million cubic meters, would require a workforce of 1,000 laborers working day and night for more than 6 years. Some estimates run far higher, and yet there is no record of them. None. No mention in any imperial chronicle. No reference in any local history. No surviving tools, no inscriptions, no carvings, no graves of the workers, no spoil heaps where the excavated stone was dumped. The Longyu Caves are believed to date to at least the 2nd century BC, possibly earlier, making them roughly contemporary with the Han Dynasty. This was a literate, bureaucratic civilization. The Chinese kept meticulous records of public works, of taxes, of conscripted labor, of the construction of roads and tombs and walls. But of the caves, they wrote nothing. Mainstream archaeologists have offered cautious theories. Perhaps the caves were quarries, dug to extract sandstone for nearby construction, though no structure in the surrounding region appears to have been built from Longyu stone, and no one quarries with such delicate decorative chisel work. Perhaps they were storage depots for grain or weapons. Perhaps they were barracks for an army hidden from invading forces. Perhaps they were tombs, though no bodies, no artifacts, no funeral goods of any kind have ever been found inside them. Each theory falters on the same questions. Why the impossible precision? Why the uniform tool marks across every surface? Why the careful spacing between caverns? Why no record in a civilization that recorded everything? Some researchers have looked further afield. The geometry of the caves, with their sloping walls and tapered pillars, has been compared to other ancient megalithic sites, to the rock-cut temples of India, to the underground complexes of Cappadocia, to the subterranean chambers found beneath certain pyramids. A few have suggested the Longyu Caves are part of a wider, older pattern, evidence of a forgotten engineering tradition that once stretched across the ancient world, predating the civilizations we now credit with building these structures. Others have wondered whether the caves were never meant for human use at all, whether they served some purpose we have not yet imagined, acoustic, ceremonial, astronomical. Sound behaves strangely inside them. The chisel patterns, when viewed from certain angles, seem to align in ways that could be decorative, or could be something else. A code, perhaps, a map, or simply the trace of a tool whose design has been lost. Today, a handful of the caverns have been opened to visitors. Wooden walkways descend into the cool dark. Lights illuminate the carved walls. Tourists walk through chambers that, for 2,000 years, held nothing but black water and silence. Above them, the hills look as they always have, unremarkable, agricultural, ordinary. The other caves, the ones that have not been drained, remain sealed beneath their ponds. No one knows how many more there may be. No one has surveyed every pool in the region. The villagers, it is said, have stopped opening them. Who carved the Longyu Caves? Why? And what, if anything, did they intend for us to find? Or never to find? Beneath the still water of those bottomless ponds, the hills of Zhejiang are green and damp and full of life. But not all of China's mysteries lie in such gentle country. Travel west, far west, across the Great Plains, beyond the Yellow River, beyond the high passes of the Kunlun Mountains, into a land where the air thins, the soil dries, and the silence grows immense. Here in the empty spaces of the Qinghai Plateau, the next mystery waits. And it is older, perhaps, than anything that should exist. Northwestern China, Qinghai Province, an arid, wind-scoured basin where almost nothing grows. The landscape is a study in absence. Pale earth, scattered stone, distant mountains hazed by dust. At the heart of this desolation lies a salt lake called Tosunhu, its waters mineral dark and unmoving. And rising from the flatness near the lake's southern shore stands a single, sharp peak. The locals call it Mount Baigong. It is not a large mountain, pyramidal in shape, with 3 caves cut into its eastern face. 2 have collapsed inward over the centuries. The third remains open, a triangular mouth in the rock, perhaps 6 meters high, leading into the heart of the mountain. There is no record of who cut these caves, no inscription, no carving, no artifact left behind by whoever stood here long enough to hollow out a mountain. But it is what lies inside the open cave and in the salt flats around it that has drawn the attention of geologists, engineers, and archaeologists from across the world. Pipes. Hundreds of them. Some embedded in the cave walls, some protruding from the floor at sharp, deliberate angles, some running in straight lines across the salt-encrusted ground beyond the cave mouth, vanishing into the earth and reappearing at the edge of the lake. They range in size from the width of a toothpick to the diameter of a human hand. They are made of a hard, rust-colored material, heavily oxidized iron mostly, with traces of silica and calcium oxide, and they appear to be, by every visible measure, manufactured. The pipes were first reported in the late 1990s by a group of American scientists surveying the region, and the news traveled quickly. In 2002, a team from the Beijing Institute of Geology arrived to study them. Samples were taken. Tests were run. The results, when they came back, were difficult to reconcile. The iron in the pipes was dated to roughly 150,000 years old. Human beings, as far as the archaeological record permits us to say, did not begin smelting iron until perhaps 3,000 years ago. The first known foundries, in Anatolia, in Mesopotamia, in the land stretching south through Palestine and into Egypt, appear in the archaeological record around the 2nd millennium BC. Before that, iron exists only in meteorites, or as natural ore, untouched by human craft. And yet here, in a barren basin in northwestern China, were structures that resembled iron piping, set into rock that had not been disturbed in human memory. The region around Mount Baigong shows no sign of ancient settlement. No villages, no tools, no bones. The nearest town is more than 40 kilometers away, and the area is so inhospitable that even nomadic herders rarely linger. Who then had laid the pipes? Mainstream geology has offered an answer. The leading scientific explanation suggests the Baigong pipes are not artificial at all, but the fossilized remains of ancient tree roots. During a period of intense geological activity, perhaps when the surrounding plateau was a forested floodplain, organic material became buried in iron-rich sediment. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the wood decayed and was replaced by minerals, a process called pedogenesis. What we see now, the theory holds, are mineralized casts of vanished trees, hollow where the wood once was, preserved in the shape of the roots that produced them. The hypothesis has serious support. Plant cell structures have been identified in some samples. Similar formations have been documented in other parts of the world, notably in Louisiana, in regions where ancient swamp forests once stood. But the theory does not account for everything. Some of the pipes are too straight, too uniform, too geometrically precise to resemble any known root system. Some run in parallel lines across distances of dozens of meters. Some terminate inside the lake, where they descend into the dark water at angles too consistent to be natural. The iron content in certain samples is unusually pure, and the cave itself, with its triangular opening and its smooth interior walls, does not appear to be a natural formation. A 2007 expedition by Chinese state media reported faint, unexplained radioactivity in some areas around the pipes, a finding that has been disputed, debated, and never fully resolved. This is where the speculation begins. Some have suggested the pipes are the remnants of an ancient civilization, far older than the historical record allows, whose technology rivaled or surpassed our own, and whose existence has been entirely erased by time. Others have proposed that they are the work of visitors, that the Qinghai Plateau, with its high altitude, its clear skies, and its dramatic isolation, would make an ideal site for some kind of base, some kind of outpost, some kind of installation belonging to intelligences not of this earth. The Chinese government, for a brief period, even installed a sign near the cave referring to it as the site of an ET relics. The sign is gone now. The investigations have grown quiet. The pipes remain. What were they meant to carry, if anything? Where did they lead? And if they are merely the ghosts of ancient trees, why do they look to so many who stand before them so unmistakably like the work of a hand? Pipes that may not be pipes. Trees that may not be trees. The deep past has a way of blurring the line between what was made and what merely became, between the work of hands and the slow, patient sculpture of time. But sometimes the past speaks plainly. Sometimes it leaves not strange objects, but words. And sometimes those words, written down in careful detail by people who believed every line of them, are stranger still than anything carved into stone. Travel south and west, across the deserts of Central Asia, into the cradle of recorded civilization, the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. Here, more than 5,000 years ago, the first cities of the world rose from the silt of the river valleys: Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, Kish. Cities of mud brick and ziggurat, of marketplace and temple, of priests and kings and scribes who pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, and in doing so, invented history. It was in this land that a remarkable document was composed, copied and recopied across centuries. We know it today as the Sumerian King List. The most complete surviving version is a small, four-sided clay prism, roughly 20 centimeters tall, inscribed in cuneiform script on every face. It was found in the early 20th century at the site of ancient Larsa in southern Iraq, and is now held at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It dates to around 1800 BC, though it draws on traditions far older. Other fragments of the same list have been recovered from sites scattered across Mesopotamia, from Nippur, from Susa, from the libraries of long-vanished palaces. They agree in their broad strokes with one another. The list is exactly what its name suggests: a roll call of the kings of Sumer, in order, from the deepest antiquity down to the historical present of the scribes who compiled it. Many of the names belong to rulers we now know to have been real. Figures attested in inscriptions, in administrative records, in the archaeology of the cities they ruled. Sargon of Akkad, Gilgamesh of Uruk, hero of the world's oldest surviving epic. The kings of Ur, whose tombs have been excavated, whose treasures have been recovered, whose existence is beyond dispute. But the list does not begin with them. It begins with a single extraordinary line inscribed at the top of the prism in careful, unambiguous cuneiform. When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. What follows is a sequence of rulers whose reigns defy every category of historical record. 8 kings, ruling across 5 antediluvian cities, before a great flood swept the world clean. The first of them, Alulim, is said to have reigned for 28,800 years. His successor, Alaungar, for 36,000. The reigns continue in this manner: 21,000 years, 18,600, 43,200. The total span of these 8 kings before the flood is given as 241,200 years. Then the list pauses. A line is drawn across the clay. Then the flood swept over. After the flood, kingship is lowered again, and the reigns continue, but they grow shorter. The post-flood kings rule for 1,200 years, 900, 600. Gradually, century by century, the numbers contract toward the human. By the time the list reaches rulers we can independently verify through archaeology, the reigns have settled into ordinary lengths. 30 years, 20, 10. The list ends in the recognizable, dusty arithmetic of mortal life. What are we to make of this? Mainstream historians have long argued that the early portions of the list are mythological. The enormous reigns, they suggest, are symbolic, perhaps representing dynasties rather than individuals, perhaps reflecting a numerical system based on sacred arithmetic, perhaps simply the legendary embellishments common to the founding myths of every civilization. The fact that the list eventually narrows into verifiable history, they argue, is unsurprising. Many ancient peoples blended the mythic and the historical in this way. The Egyptians did. The Greeks did. The Hebrew chroniclers, whose patriarchs in Genesis lived for 900 years before a similar flood, did the same. This is the cautious reading, and it is reasonable, but others have looked at the list and asked different questions. Why does the flood appear at exactly the same point in the narrative as it does in the much later Epic of Gilgamesh, in the Babylonian Atrahasis, in the Hebrew scriptures composed in the land stretching from Mesopotamia through Palestine? Why do so many ancient civilizations, separated by geography, by language, by centuries, record the same break, the same catastrophe, the same fall from a longer-lived age into a shorter one? Are these merely echoes of a shared literary tradition? Or are they fragments of a memory, distorted, transmitted, garbled across millennia, but rooted in something that actually happened? And the kings themselves, the names, Alulem, Enmenluana, Dumuzid the shepherd, they are written without ceremony, without explanation, as if the scribes considered them no more remarkable than the kings who came after. The Sumerians did not seem to think they were inventing these figures. They thought they were remembering them. Some researchers working at the edges of accepted scholarship have suggested the list preserves the trace of a civilization that existed before the one we know. A deeper antiquity, swept away by the same flood the list itself describes. Others wonder whether the long reigns refer to something else entirely. Not human beings, but something the scribes had no other word for. Beings from elsewhere. Teachers, visitors, gods in the older sense of that word. The clay prism remains in its glass case, in Oxford, lit softly. Its lines are sharp, its language is plain. The scribes who wrote it are dust, but the names they preserved are still here, and we are still reading them. Who were the kings before the flood? Kings before the flood. A flood that, in so many ancient memories, swept the old world away. It is a story told in clay, in scripture, in oral tradition, across cultures that should never have shared a single tale. And if any part of that memory is true, if there really was a world before our world, drowned beneath rising seas, then somewhere, perhaps, the bones of it still lie beneath the waves. Not in metaphor, not in myth, in stone. Travel east, across the breadth of Asia, to the very edge of the Pacific. Beyond the southern tip of Japan, beyond the long arc of the Ryukyu Islands, lies a small, wind-battered island called Yonaguni. It is the westernmost inhabited point of Japan, closer to Taiwan than to Tokyo. The waters around it are deep, treacherous, and famous among divers for their schools of hammerhead sharks. Few people come here. Fewer still descend into the cold blue beneath the cliffs. In the spring of 1986, a local diver named Kihachiro Arataki was searching the waters off the southern coast of the island, scouting new sites for sport divers. He swam down through the currents, past walls of coral and dark schools of fish, until he reached a depth of roughly 25 meters. And there, in the gloom, he saw something that stopped him. A wall. Not a ridge, not a coral formation. A wall, vast, smooth, and rising sharply from the seabed. Step terraces, sharp 90-degree angles, long flat platforms cut at consistent levels. Stairways, what appeared to be a road. The structure stretched for nearly 150 meters in length and rose more than 25 meters from the ocean floor. It looked unmistakably like architecture. The discovery would come to be known as the Yonaguni Monument, and in the 4 decades since, it has divided scholars, scientists, and divers more sharply than perhaps any other underwater site on Earth. The geology of the region is well understood. The Ryukyu chain sits along an active tectonic boundary. Earthquakes are frequent. The bedrock is sandstone, a sedimentary stone that fractures by its nature along straight lines and right angles. This is the foundation of the mainstream scientific position. The Yonaguni Monument, the prevailing view holds, is a natural formation. A dramatic one, certainly. An unusual one, but not, in the end, made by human hands. Sandstone breaks the way the monument is shaped. Wave action and currents have refined its features over tens of thousands of years. Nature, given enough time and the right material, can produce shapes that look astonishingly like design. This is the sober reading. It is supported by a number of geologists, including some who have personally surveyed the site. But not all of them. In the 1990s, a Japanese marine geologist named Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus began studying the monument in detail. He dived to it repeatedly. He measured its features. He mapped its dimensions. And he came, gradually, to a different conclusion. Kimura identified what he believed to be carved steps, drilled holes, dressed stone surfaces, and even faint traces of figures. What he interpreted as the eroded outlines of human and animal forms cut into the rock. He found stones that appeared to have been moved, deliberately, from their original positions. He noted the curious selectivity of the formation, the way some sections appeared shaped while others, only meters away, remained rough and natural. In his analysis, the Yonaguni Monument was not a freak of geology. It was a city, or the ruin of one. A structure built by human beings when the seabed it now rests on was dry land. And this, perhaps, is where the deepest mystery lies. Sea levels in the Western Pacific have not always been what they are today. During the last ice age, when vast quantities of the world's water were locked into glaciers, the oceans stood far lower than they do now. The continental shelves of East Asia were exposed. Land bridges connected islands. Yonaguni itself was part of a larger landmass, joined to Taiwan and to the Asian continent by broad coastal plains. The site of the monument, 25 meters underwater, would have stood on dry ground. The last time it stood above the waves was approximately 10,000 years ago. If the Yonaguni Monument is artificial, if Kimura is correct, then it was built before the rise of every civilization we recognize. Before the Sumerians inscribed their king lists, before the first stones of the Egyptian pyramids were quarried, before agriculture itself was widespread. It would predate by thousands of years every mainstream estimate of when human beings first began to construct monumental architecture. It would mean, simply, that the history we have written is incomplete. The implications are enormous, and the evidence is contested. Some researchers see in Yonaguni a possible link to the legends of Mu, the lost continent of Pacific tradition, a sunken civilization said to have once spanned the ocean before vanishing beneath the waves. Others connect it to the broader pattern of flood myths, to the drowned cities of Indian tradition, to the Atlantis of Plato. Still others remain unconvinced of any of this and see only stone and water and the patient work of geological time. Today, divers still descend to the monument. They glide along its terraces. They run their hands over its corners. They photograph what may be a face carved into one of its boulders, eyes, a brow, a mouth, or what may be only the suggestion of a face, conjured by a mind hungry for meaning. The currents are strong here. The water is cold. Visibility comes and goes. If a city once stood on this spot, who lived in it? And what else in the dark below has the ocean been keeping to itself? The ocean keeps its secrets in the dark, but the desert keeps its own. And it keeps them in the open, in the pitiless light of the sun, where they have lain undisturbed for 2,000 years and more, waiting for someone, finally, to look up. Travel east, across the Pacific, to the western coast of South America. Beyond the cold currents of the Humboldt, beyond the green river valleys of coastal Peru, lies one of the driest places on Earth, the Nazca Desert. A high, flat plateau wedged between the Andes and the sea, where the rain almost never falls and the wind moves only in slow, patient drifts across the surface of the stone. It is a landscape stripped to its essentials: pale earth, dark pebbles, a horizon that bends gently under the weight of the sky. For centuries, travelers crossed this plateau without noticing anything strange. Spanish chroniclers in the 16th century mentioned curious markings in the dust, long straight lines stretching across the desert floor. But they recorded them only in passing. Roads, perhaps, old paths, nothing that warranted a closer look. Then, in the 1920s and 1930s, commercial aviation came to Peru. Small planes began crossing the southern coast, flying low between Lima and the cities further south. And from the air, the pilot saw something that no one walking the desert had ever truly seen. The ground was covered in drawings, enormous figures etched into the desert floor on a scale so vast that they could only be perceived from above. A hummingbird, 93 meters from beak to tail. A spider, 46 meters across. A monkey with a curling spiral tail. A condor with outstretched wings. A whale. A dog. A tree. A pair of hands. And alongside the figures, hundreds upon hundreds of perfectly straight lines, some running for more than 10 kilometers without deviation, crossing valleys and ridges as if the terrain itself were no obstacle. Geometric shapes, trapezoids, triangles, spirals, laid out with mathematical precision across the plain. Together, they cover an area of roughly 450 square kilometers. There are more than 300 figurative drawings, more than 700 geometric forms, and over 10,000 individual lines. They are believed to have been made between roughly 500 BC and 500 AD by the people we now call the Nazca, a pre-Incan civilization that flourished along the southern Peruvian coast. The technique in itself is not a mystery. The desert floor at Nazca is covered in a thin layer of dark iron-oxidized pebbles, sitting atop a paler, lighter-colored sand beneath. Remove the pebbles, and the figure beneath stands out in sharp contrast, a line of light against a field of dark. The arid climate, with its near-total absence of rain and wind, has preserved the lines with extraordinary fidelity. What was scratched into the desert 2,000 years ago looks, today, almost as it did the day it was made. What is mysterious is not how they were made. It is why. The figures cannot be seen from the ground. Standing on the plateau, even in the middle of the great hummingbird, a person sees only a shallow trench in the dust, indistinguishable from any other. The drawings reveal themselves only from the air, from heights of several hundred meters or more. They were composed, in other words, for an audience that could fly. But the Nazca, by every measure of mainstream archaeology, could not. This is the puzzle that has occupied scholars for nearly a century. The drawings are too large to have been made by accident, and too precise to have been made without some method of overseeing the design. Yet the people who made them appear on the surface to have had no way of confirming that their work was correct. A number of explanations have been proposed. The most widely accepted theory, championed in the mid-20th century by the German-born researcher Maria Reiche, is that the lines are astronomical. Reiche spent more than 50 years on the plateau, sleeping in a small house at its edge, sweeping the lines clean with a household broom, measuring the angles of every figure and every geometric form. She came to believe that the Nazca lines were a vast astronomical calendar, that the lines pointed to the rising and setting of the sun, the moon, and certain bright stars at significant times of year. Other researchers have proposed that the lines were ritual pathways, walked in religious processions, that the figures represent the Nazca pantheon, drawn for the gods to see from above. that the lines marked the locations of underground water sources, vital in a desert where every drop was precious, that they served as ceremonial offerings, works of devotion meant not to be viewed by human eyes at all, but by the divine. And then there are the older questions, the harder ones. How did a people without aircraft compose images that can only be appreciated from the sky? Some have suggested simple grid systems, scaled-up sketches transferred to the ground using ropes and stakes, a technique that, in theory, could account for the precision. Others have pointed to the steep hillsides at the edge of the plateau, from which some of the figures can, with effort, be partially seen. Still others have wondered whether the Nazca possessed something we have not yet recognized. Hot air balloons, perhaps, or wooden gliders, or some lost technology of observation that vanished with their civilization. A few have looked at the figures themselves and asked stranger questions. Why does one of them, the famous astronaut, etched into a hillside, appear to be wearing a helmet? Why are the lines and runways, in some interpretations, oriented as if for landing? Who exactly were the drawings meant for? The wind moves softly across the plateau. The pebbles, undisturbed, hold their lines. 2,000 years on, the Nazca looked up. Or someone did. The question is who, in turn, was meant to look down. Drawings made for eyes in the sky. Lines aligned to stars. The peoples of the ancient world, again and again, seem to have reached toward something beyond themselves. Toward the heavens, toward the unseen, toward knowledge that, by the standards of their time, they should not have possessed. And occasionally, very occasionally, that knowledge comes down to us not as a marking on the earth, but as an object. Small, practical, disturbingly familiar. The kind of object that, when you hold it in your hand, asks a question you are not entirely sure you want to answer. Travel west, back across the great width of Asia, to the lands between the rivers. Mesopotamia again, but this time to its long afterlife, to the centuries when Sumer was already a memory, when the great cities of Ur and Eridu lay buried, and new empires had risen in their place. To Parthia, to Sassanid Persia, to the dusty outskirts of the city we now call Baghdad. In 1936, workers digging a railway line near the village of Kujut Rabu, just southeast of Baghdad, uncovered the remains of an ancient settlement. Among the artifacts recovered from the site was a small clay jar, unremarkable at first glance, about 14 centimeters tall, yellowish-brown, slightly bulbous, the kind of vessel that might have once held oil or wine or grain in any household of the ancient Near East. But this jar was not empty. Inside, packed carefully into the clay, was a copper cylinder. The cylinder, in turn, contained a single iron rod suspended at its center. The copper had been soldered with a lead-tin alloy. The opening of the jar had been sealed with a plug of asphalt. And there were traces, faint but unmistakable, of something acidic. Vinegar, perhaps, or fermented wine, that had once filled the cylinder and corroded the iron rod within. The artifact was sent to the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. There it was examined by a German archaeologist named Wilhelm Koenig, the museum's director at the time. Koenig looked at the jar. He looked at the copper cylinder. He looked at the iron rod, eaten away by acid. And he proposed an explanation that has haunted the artifact ever since. It was, he said, a battery, a galvanic cell, a device for generating a small electrical current. The components, Koenig pointed out, were precisely what one would expect to find in a primitive electrochemical battery. A copper electrode, an iron electrode, an acidic electrolyte, a sealed container. Replicated in modern laboratories, the design produces a measurable voltage, between half a volt and just over 1 volt, depending on the electrolyte used. Enough to electroplate a thin layer of metal. Enough, perhaps, to create a faint tingling sensation if held against the skin. The artifact, and several others like it later recovered from nearby sites, came to be known collectively as the Baghdad Battery. Its dating remains contested. Koenig initially attributed it to the Parthian period, roughly 250 BC to 224 AD. Later researchers have suggested it belongs to the Sassanid era, several centuries later. In either case, it predates the modern invention of the battery, by Alessandro Volta, in 1800, by at least 1,500 years, and possibly more than 2,000, if Koenig was right. The mainstream archaeological consensus today is cautious and skeptical. Most scholars now hold that the Baghdad battery is not a battery at all. It is, they argue, a storage vessel, most likely a container for sacred scrolls or papyri. Similar copper and iron arrangements have been found at other ancient sites, used to protect rolled documents from moisture and decay. The acidic residue in this reading is simply the chemical trace of organic matter that has long since decomposed. The asphalt seal kept the contents dry. The iron rod was structural, not functional. There is, the consensus holds, no compelling evidence that the device was ever used to generate electricity. This is a reasonable position. It is supported by a number of careful studies, and it may well be correct. But the questions persist. If the jar was meant only to hold scrolls, why the specific combination of metals, copper and iron, the two materials most suited to producing an electrochemical reaction? Why the acidic electrolyte? Why the sealed design, which would have made retrieving the supposed scrolls awkward, if not destructive? And why, in nearly a century of investigation, has not a single scrap of papyrus, parchment, or scroll material been recovered from any of the so-called batteries? Beyond these technical questions lies a stranger one. If the device could produce a current, and replicas demonstrate that it can, what was it used for? Some researchers have suggested electroplating. The ancient world, particularly the land stretching from Egypt and Palestine through Mesopotamia and Persia, was full of finely gilded objects. Thin layers of gold or silver applied to base metal. Most of this work was achieved by mechanical means, by hammering and burnishing. But a few examples have been found whose plating is so thin, so even, that some metallurgists have wondered whether something more sophisticated was involved. A galvanic process, perhaps. A current passed through a chemical bath. Others have speculated about medical uses. The Greeks and Romans were known to have applied electric eels to the bodies of patients suffering from gout and headaches. Could the Baghdad battery have served a similar purpose, providing a controlled, low-voltage current for healing or ritual? And a few have asked the largest question of all. If the device truly was a battery, who first made one? When? How was the principle discovered? And how was it lost? The jar sat for decades on a shelf in the Iraq Museum. In 2003, during the chaos that followed the invasion of Baghdad, the museum was looted. Many artifacts were stolen. The Baghdad battery, by some accounts, vanished. By others, it remains in storage, awaiting study. A small clay jar, a copper cylinder, an iron rod eaten by acid. What was it for? And how many other such objects, mistaken for ordinary things, are sitting on the shelves of museums right now, unrecognized, unexamined, waiting to be asked the right question? A jar mistaken for a battery mistaken for a jar. The line between ordinary and extraordinary, in archaeology, is often a matter of which question you happen to ask. And sometimes the most unsettling artifacts are not the ones that look strange at all, but the ones that look perfectly familiar, sitting on a museum shelf, labeled as something we have already understood. Until one day, someone walks past, glances at it, and stops. Travel west, across the deserts of Arabia, across the Red Sea, into the long green ribbon of the Nile Valley. Egypt, the land of pyramid and obelisk, of pharaoh and priest, of a civilization that endured for more than 3,000 years and left behind more artifacts, more inscriptions, more carved and painted records than any other culture of the ancient world. Just south of modern Cairo lies the great necropolis of Saqqara, a vast city of the dead, where the kings and nobles of the early dynasties were buried beneath stepped pyramids and mastabas of mud brick and stone. In 1898, a French archaeologist named Lieutenant Victor Lorette was excavating at Saqqara when his team uncovered a tomb believed to belong to a man named Pademan, an official of the Ptolemaic period. The tomb dated to roughly 200 BC. Among the burial goods recovered from the chamber were the usual offerings: figurines, papyri, small carvings of animals, and one object that, at the time, no one paid any particular attention to: a small bird, carved from sycamore wood, roughly 15 centimeters in length, lightweight, pale, its surface smoothed by a careful hand. Two outstretched wings spanning about 18 centimeters from tip to tip, a short, slightly curved beak, a vertical tail. The artifact was catalogued, packed, and sent to the Cairo Museum. There it was, placed in a drawer along with dozens of similar wooden figurines, birds, beasts, votive carvings, all assumed to be religious objects of one kind or another. Toys, perhaps, funerary offerings, symbolic representations of gods or souls. The drawer was closed. The bird sat in the dark for nearly 70 years. Then, in 1969, an Egyptian doctor and amateur archaeologist named Khalil Messiah was browsing the museum's collection when something caught his eye. Messiah was a man with an unusual background. A trained physician, he had also been a builder of model aircraft since childhood. He had spent decades studying aerodynamics, the proportions of wings and tails, the principles that allow a shape to fly. And when he looked at the small wooden bird from Saqqara, he saw something that did not look, to his trained eye, like a bird at all. The proportions were wrong. A bird, viewed from above, has wings that taper gracefully outward and a tail that fans horizontally. Flat and broad, used for steering, for braking, for adjusting lift. The Saqqara figurine had wings that were slightly swept back and a tail that was not horizontal at all. It was vertical. A flat, upright fin, set perpendicular to the body, exactly where the rudder of a modern aircraft would be. No bird, anywhere in nature, has a vertical tail, but every airplane does. Messiah examined the figurine more closely. He noted the streamlined body, the slight downward curve of the wings, what aerodynamicists call dihedral, a feature that imparts stability to a flying craft. He noted the absence of legs, which a bird sculpture would almost certainly include. He noted the way the wings were set, at a precise angle, into the body. The carving, he believed, was not a bird at all. It was a model of something that flew, something engineered. He published his findings. He brought the artifact to the attention of the Egyptian Ministry of Culture. A committee was formed. The figurine, which had been catalogued for decades simply as wooden bird, was reclassified. It was placed on display with a small placard in the Cairo Museum, and it became known in popular discussion, if not in mainstream scholarship, as the Saqqara bird. Tests were conducted, wind tunnel experiments, replicas were built and flown. The results were mixed, and have remained so. Some replicas, when launched, glided with surprising stability, covering significant distances before descending gently to the ground. Others did not. The original figurine lacks one feature that any true glider would require: a horizontal stabilizer at the base of the tail, the small wing-like surface that prevents an aircraft from pitching uncontrollably up or down. Without it, sustained flight is impossible. Some researchers have suggested that the Saqqara bird may once have had such a stabilizer, a small wooden tailplane glued or pegged into the rear of the figurine, and that this piece has been lost over the centuries, leaving only a faint groove where it might once have fit. Others have argued that no such piece ever existed, and that the figurine is simply a stylized representation of a bird, perhaps a falcon or a hawk, whose unusual proportions reflect the conventions of Egyptian religious art rather than any aeronautical knowledge. This is the cautious reading, and it is the position of most mainstream Egyptologists today. The vertical tail, in their view, may represent the upright posture of a falcon at rest, or a stylized convention common in late-period Egyptian carvings. The dihedral of the wings is coincidence, or the natural result of how a craftsman shapes a bird in flight. The artifact, however curious, is religious in nature, a votive object, a symbol, nothing more. But the questions, as always, do not entirely go away. Why this particular bird, with this particular tail? Why these proportions found in no other carving from the same period? Why the absence of feet, the streamlining, the careful symmetry that seems so unlike the casual votive carvings stacked beside it in the same drawer? And if the figurine is purely religious, why does it work, at least partially, when launched? Why does it glide when so many other small wooden carvings of similar size do not? Some have looked at the Saqqara bird and asked larger questions still. The ancient Egyptians, they point out, left behind hieroglyphs and reliefs that, to certain interpreters, appeared to depict aircraft, helicopters, even submarines. The famous Abydos carving in the temple of Seti I has long been a source of fascination for those who see in its weathered stone the outlines of modern machines. Whether these resemblances are meaningful or merely accidental is, of course, contested. Restoration, palimpsest, plaster repair, all have been proposed as innocent explanations. But the resemblances persist, and the Saqqara bird, small and wooden and silent, sits in its case in Cairo, asking the same uncomfortable question. Did the Egyptians understand flight? Not in the way we do, perhaps, not with engines or fuel or wings of metal, but in some other way, some forgotten way, a way that left behind as its only surviving evidence a small wooden figurine in the tomb of a forgotten official, mistaken for a votive offering, slipped into a drawer, and forgotten for 70 years. How many other such objects, one wonders, are still in those drawers, still labeled as something they are not? And what would we see if we looked again? A small wooden bird slipped into a drawer and forgotten, a jar mistaken for a vessel, when it may have been something else entirely. The longer one studies the artifacts of Egypt, the harder it becomes to draw a clean line between what the ancients meant to depict and what we, looking back, are willing to allow them to have known. And nowhere is that line more troubling, perhaps, than in a darkened chamber beneath the floor of a temple in southern Egypt, where, carved into the limestone walls, a series of images has been waiting in candlelight and silence for more than 2,000 years. Travel south from Saqqara, up the long thread of the Nile, past Memphis, past the ruins of ancient Thebes, into the warm valleys of Upper Egypt. About 60 kilometers north of Luxor, on the western bank of the river, lies a place the ancient Egyptians called Unet, and which we now call Dendera. Here stands one of the best preserved temple complexes in all of Egypt, the Temple of Hathor, goddess of love, music, and motherhood. Its walls are still intact. Its painted ceilings, washed in centuries of soot, still glow faintly with the colors of the original pigments. Its hypostyle hall remains roofed, its columns crowned with the cow-eared face of the goddess herself. The temple as it stands today dates to the Ptolemaic period, with construction continuing into the early Roman era, roughly between 125 BC and the 1st century AD. But the site itself is far older. Beneath the present temple lie the foundations of earlier structures, going back at least to the Old Kingdom, and possibly earlier still. The Egyptians believed the site to be ancient even by their own standards. Inscriptions in the temple refer to architectural plans drawn from texts that were already, in the Ptolemaic age, considered to be of great antiquity, predating the historical record itself. Beneath the main temple, accessed by a narrow stone stairway that descends into the bedrock, lies a series of small, low-ceilinged chambers known as the crypts. They are dark, even today. Visitors must stoop to enter. The air is cool and still. Electric lights installed for the benefit of tourists illuminate walls that for most of their history saw no light at all, or saw only the flickering glow of oil lamps carried by priests on errands we no longer understand. It is on the walls of these crypts, particularly in the southernmost chamber, that the images appear. There are several of them, repeated with variations across the chamber's walls. Each scene shows a similar arrangement. A large, elongated, bulb-shaped object, pointed at one end, rounded at the other, stands or rests on what appears to be a pillar or support. Inside the bulb, a long, sinuous form curls along its length, tapering to a point near the narrow end. A figure stands beside the bulb, sometimes touching it, sometimes holding it upright. Beneath the bulb, a small kneeling figure. Above and behind the scene, hieroglyphic inscriptions and other symbolic elements. A baboon holding knives, a djed pillar, the Eye of Horus. To Egyptologists, the meaning of these images is established. The scene, they explain, is a religious one. The bulb-shaped object is a representation of a lotus flower, from which emerges a snake, a recurring symbol in Egyptian cosmology, representing creation, rebirth, and the primordial waters from which the world arose. The pillar supporting the bulb is the djed, a sacred symbol associated with the god Osiris. The kneeling figure beneath is a representation of He, the deity of infinity. The accompanying inscriptions, when translated, refer to the daily rebirth of the sun god, the renewal of cosmic order, and the eternal cycles of creation. This is the mainstream interpretation. It is supported by the surrounding inscriptions, by parallels with other Egyptian religious art, and by the well-documented use of lotus and serpent imagery throughout the temples of the Nile. There is, in this reading, nothing unusual about the Dendera reliefs. They are religious images, no stranger than any other. And yet, in the late 20th century, a number of researchers, engineers, electricians, and independent investigators began to look at the images differently. They saw in the elongated bulb the unmistakable shape of a glass envelope. They saw in the curling serpent the form of a filament. They saw in the pillar supporting the bulb the shape of an insulator. They saw in the cable that runs from the base of the bulb to a small box near the floor the outline of an electrical conduit. The box, in their interpretation, was a power source. The figure standing beside the bulb was holding it, supporting it, operating it, much as a worker today might hold a fluorescent tube being installed in a fixture. What the Orthodox view calls a lotus and a snake, this alternative reading calls a light bulb. The interpretation is not a new one. It was first proposed in detail in the 1980s by an Austrian electrical engineer named Walter Garn, and it has been elaborated since by a number of writers and researchers. The argument has a certain internal coherence. The proportions of the bulb, in the Dendera reliefs, are strikingly similar to the proportions of a Crookes tube, an early form of electrical discharge tube developed in the 19th century. The serpent inside the bulb resembles the glowing plasma filament that forms inside such a tube when current is applied. The cable, the insulator, the power source, all have their counterparts in the relief. Even more provocatively, proponents of this interpretation have pointed out a long-standing puzzle of Egyptian archaeology. The interiors of many Egyptian tombs and temples are decorated with extraordinarily detailed paintings and carvings, work that would have required substantial light to execute. Yet there are no soot deposits on the ceilings of these chambers, no traces of the smoke that oil lamps or torches would inevitably have produced. How, the question goes, did the artisans see what they were doing? What lit their work? Mainstream Egyptologists have answered this question with proposals involving polished bronze mirrors, which could in principle have reflected sunlight from outside the tomb deep into its interior chambers. The technique has been demonstrated. It works, but it requires multiple mirrors, careful alignment, and constant adjustment, and there is no surviving record of such a system being used. The lack of soot remains. The reliefs at Dendera, of course, do not prove anything. They are images. They are symbolic. They were carved by artists working within a long, complex religious tradition whose iconography we still do not fully understand. To see in them a depiction of electrical lighting may be to project our own modern preoccupations onto an ancient culture that thought and saw in fundamentally different ways. Or it may not. The carvings remain on the walls of the southern crypt, exactly where they have always been. Tourists pass through, photograph them, and move on. The lotus blooms, the serpent curls. The figure stands, holding whatever it is that he is holding. Was it a flower? Was it a flame? And how would we tell the difference, 2,000 years later, by the light of a tour guide's flashlight in a crypt beneath a temple in the dark? A flower or a flame? A bird or a glider? So much of what the ancients left behind sits in this uncertain territory, between the clearly understood and the stubbornly unexplained. Sometimes the mystery lies in scale, sometimes in age, and sometimes in something far more disorienting, an object that survives in many forms, in many places, across a vast and well-documented civilization. And yet, despite all the records that civilization left behind, no one ever bothered to write down what it was for. Travel north and west, out of the warm valleys of Egypt, across the Mediterranean, into the cooler, greener provinces of the Roman Empire. Gaul, Britannia, Germania, the northern frontier of a state that, at its height, stretched from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the deserts of Syria, from the highlands of Scotland to the lands south through Palestine and into the Egyptian delta. A civilization that built roads still in use today, aqueducts that still carry water, and laws that still echo through the legal codes of half the modern world. A civilization that was, above all, obsessive about writing things down. Beginning in the 18th century and continuing to the present day, archaeologists working in the northern provinces of the former Roman Empire began to find a peculiar object. Small, hollow, made of bronze, occasionally of stone, cast in the shape of a regular dodecahedron, a 12-sided geometric solid, each face a perfect pentagon. Each face is pierced by a circular hole, and each hole is of a different diameter from the others. At the corners where the faces meet, small spherical knobs project outward, raising the object slightly off any surface on which it might rest. They range in size from about 4 centimeters across to over 11 centimeters. Most are around 8. They are finely made, clearly cast in a mold, then carefully finished by hand. The metalwork is precise. The geometry is exact. They are, by every measure of craftsmanship, the product of skilled artisans working within a sophisticated metallurgical tradition. To date, more than 120 of these objects have been recovered. They have been found across an enormous geographic range, in modern France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the United Kingdom. They have been found in Roman military camps, in the foundations of villas, in the graves of the wealthy, and in the buried hoards of ordinary households. They are dated, on the basis of associated artifacts, to roughly the 2nd through 4th centuries AD. They are unmistakably Roman, and no one knows what they are. This is not a case of an obscure object missing from 1 or 2 minor sources. The Romans wrote prolifically. Their generals wrote memoirs. Their scholars wrote encyclopedias. Their craftsmen wrote technical manuals. Their poets, their satirists, their merchants, their lawyers, all left behind a vast literature describing in remarkable detail the everyday objects and practices of Roman life. We know what the Romans ate, how they bathed, how they conducted business, how they trained their soldiers, how they buried their dead. We know the names of obscure tools used by particular trades. We know the precise weights used in their markets and the standard dimensions of their bricks. We do not know what the dodecahedrons were for. Not a single Roman text, not one inscription, not one passing reference, not one diagram or technical note describes them. They appear in the archaeological record fully formed, in significant numbers, distributed across a wide geographic area, and then, with the collapse of the Western Empire in the 5th century, they vanish. The tradition of making them ends. The knowledge of their use, whatever it was, is lost. The theories proposed to explain them have multiplied for more than 2 centuries. Some scholars have suggested they were measuring instruments, perhaps surveying tools used by Roman engineers and military officers. The varying diameters of the holes, in this view, might correspond to standard distances or angles, allowing the user to sight through the object and determine the position of a target. Variations on this theory have proposed that the dodecahedrons were rangefinders for artillery, used to calculate the distance to enemy fortifications. Others have suggested they were calendrical or astronomical devices. The 12 faces, after all, correspond neatly to the 12 months of the Roman year, or to the 12 signs of the zodiac. By aligning the object with the position of the sun or certain stars, a user might have been able to determine the season, the time of planting, or the date of religious festivals. Still others have proposed more humble functions: candle holders, dice, toys, ornaments, wig stands, devices for testing the bore of pipes or the diameter of coins, spool-like tools for knitting woolen gloves, a theory popularized in recent years by experimental demonstrations, though one that struggles to explain why such a tool would be made of expensive bronze rather than simple wood, why it would be so finely crafted, and why the Romans, who wore woolen garments year-round, never mentioned this device anywhere in their voluminous writings on textiles. Some of the dodecahedrons have been found alongside coins in what appear to be the buried savings of ordinary households. This has led to the suggestion that they were valuable in themselves. Perhaps prestige objects, perhaps religious or magical talismans. A few have been found in graves, in positions that suggest they were considered important enough to accompany their owners into the afterlife. The grave of a Roman woman in modern Hungary contained a dodecahedron held in her hand. This last detail in particular has drawn attention. A talisman, a symbol, an object of personal devotion. The Romans had a rich tradition of magical and religious practice, much of it imported from Egypt, from Greece, from the eastern provinces stretching down through Palestine and into Mesopotamia. Geometric forms, particularly the regular polyhedra known to Greek mathematics, were associated in certain mystical traditions with the elements and with cosmic order. The dodecahedron, in Plato's writings, was the shape of the universe itself. Could the Roman dodecahedrons have been ritual objects used in religious practices we do not understand, and that the Romans, for whatever reason, did not write down? It is possible. But it is only possible. Recent finds have only deepened the mystery. In 2023, a complete bronze dodecahedron was discovered in a field in Lincolnshire, England, by amateur archaeologists. Beautifully preserved, still bearing traces of its original surface. It was the largest example yet found in Britain, and it raised, again, all the same questions that have surrounded these objects since the first one was unearthed 2.5 centuries ago. The dodecahedrons sit now in museum cases across Europe. In Paris, in London, in Bonn, in Budapest. They are labeled cautiously as Roman dodecahedrons, function unknown. Visitors lean close to the glass and stare at them, small, geometric, finely worked, silent. What were they for? And what does it mean that an entire civilization, which wrote down almost everything else, never thought it necessary to tell us? An object whose makers wrote everything down, and yet wrote nothing about it. Sometimes the silence of the historical record is itself the mystery, and what is missing speaks louder than what remains. But there is another kind of mystery, stranger still, the kind that arrives not through the slow patience of archaeology, but through a single story, told once, told vividly, told with photographs and witnesses and dates, and then, somehow, fading into doubt. A story that may be true, or may never have happened at all, or maybe something in between, hovering at the edge of the record like a face half glimpsed in a mirror. Travel back, once more, to the high country of Asia, to the great mountain wall that separates China from the Tibetan Plateau, the Bayanhar Mountains, a remote windswept range of ridges and valleys, snow-capped in winter, golden with grass in summer. Few roads cross this country. Even today, large stretches of it are reached only by pack animals and footpaths. In the middle of the 20th century, when the story we are about to tell is said to have taken place, much of it had scarcely been mapped at all. The year is 1938. According to the account that would later emerge, an expedition of Chinese archaeologists, led by a Professor Chi Pu-te of Beijing University, was working in the Bayanhar region when one of his students reported a curious discovery in a cave high on the mountainside. The expedition climbed up. They entered the cave, and inside they found something none of them could quite explain. Graves. Rows of small graves cut into the stone floor of the cavern, each containing the skeleton of a small humanoid figure. The skeletons were strange, short, barely more than a meter tall, slender, almost frail, with unusually large skulls, out of proportion to the rest of the body. The walls of the cave were decorated with paintings. According to the story, these paintings depicted figures with similar large heads, alongside the sun, the moon, and the stars, with lines connecting the celestial bodies to the strange beings on the ground. And among the graves, set into the floor of the cave, were the stones. Hundreds of them, by the most expansive accounts, disc-shaped, roughly 30 centimeters across, each disc with a small hole pierced through its exact center, and spiraling outward from that central hole, etched into the surface of the stone in a fine groove, was a line of tiny markings. A script, though one resembling no known writing system on Earth. Each disc bore the same kind of spiraling text, running like the groove of a phonograph record from center to edge. The discs were collected, the story goes. They were brought back to Beijing. They were studied for more than 2 decades by various researchers who could make no sense of them. And then, in the early 1960s, a Chinese scholar named Sun Nui claimed to have deciphered them. What the spiraling script revealed, he reported, was a record of catastrophe. A people called the Dropa, the inscription said, had descended from the sky in flying craft. Their ships had crashed in the mountains. Unable to repair their vessels, the Dropa had tried to make peaceful contact with the local inhabitants, a tribe called the Han. But they had been hunted instead, killed for their strange appearance, and forced to take refuge in the caves where their remains, 12,000 years later, were finally discovered. Nui's translation, by his own account, was rejected by his academic colleagues and suppressed. Disheartened, he left China, emigrated to Japan, and died not long afterward. This is the story, and this is where the difficulty begins. There is no record in any verified Chinese academic archive of a Professor Qi Pute at Beijing University in 1938. There is no record of a scholar named Sun Nui, a name that, to Chinese speakers, does not even appear to be Chinese. The expedition to the Bayanhar Mountains, as described, has no corroborating documentation. The discs themselves, in the most widely circulated photographs, appear to be ordinary stone artifacts of the kind known across China. Neolithic ritual objects called Bai discs, used in burials for thousands of years and entirely unmysterious to mainstream archaeology. The supposed spiraling script in clear photographs is not visible at all. The story of the Dropa stones first appeared in print in a German vegetarian magazine in 1962. It was elaborated over the following years in books and articles by writers associated with the ancient astronaut movement. Most prominently, the Russian-born researcher Vyacheslav Zaitsev, who introduced the story to Western audiences in the early 1970s. From there, it traveled. It was repeated in popular books on unexplained mysteries. It was illustrated with photographs of stone discs that, on close examination, do not match the descriptions in the original account. It became, over time, one of the most widely known artifacts in the entire field of unexplained archaeology. And it may not exist at all. The mainstream view today among professional archaeologists and historians is that the Dropa stones are a hoax, or perhaps not even a hoax in the deliberate sense, but a slow accumulation of misattribution, mistranslation, and embellishment, building over decades into a story that bears little resemblance to anything that ever physically happened. There are no Dropa stones in any verified museum collection. There are no peer-reviewed scientific studies of them. There are no laboratory analyses. There is, in a strict evidentiary sense, nothing to study at all. And yet the story persists. It persists because it is too strange to ignore and too specific to dismiss without unease. It persists because some of the photographs do appear to show real stone discs, even if their identification is contested. It persists because the Bayanhar Mountains are real and remote and large enough that almost anything could be hidden in them. It persists because a small mountain people called the Dropa do in fact exist in that region of China, and the local Han Chinese population does in fact share that landscape with them. The names in the story are not invented. They were borrowed from real ethnographic facts and woven into something that may or may not have a kernel of truth at its center. This is what makes the Dropa stones perhaps the strangest case in this entire investigation. Not because the artifacts themselves are extraordinary, but because we cannot be certain whether the artifacts ever existed in the form described. The story is the mystery. The story, with its fragments of fact and its spirals of invention, is the artifact. Somewhere in a cave in the Bayanhar Mountains, perhaps, there is nothing at all. Or perhaps there is something. A few worn discs, a few scattered bones, the faint paintings of a forgotten people, waiting in the dark for a visitor who has not yet arrived. What is true? What is not? And how do we tell the difference when the only evidence we have is a story passed from mouth to mouth across decades and languages, until even the names have grown strange? A story without an artifact. A mystery whose evidence dissolves the closer you look. Sometimes the past does this, slips between our fingers, offers a glimpse, and then withdraws. But sometimes the past does the opposite. Sometimes a man swings a hammer at the wall of his own basement, breaks through the plaster, and finds himself looking down a flight of stairs that no one in his family ever knew was there. A staircase that descends, and continues descending, past one floor, past two, past five, into a city that has been waiting beneath his house in absolute darkness for thousands of years. Travel west, out of the high country of Asia, across the great expanse of Anatolia, into the heart of modern Turkey, to the central plateau where ancient volcanoes once shaped a landscape unlike any other on Earth. The region is called Cappadocia. Its surface is famous, a country of soft volcanic rock carved by wind and water into spires, pinnacles, and twisting valleys, the so-called fairy chimneys that rise from the earth like the masts of buried ships. Tourists come here by the thousands. They ride hot air balloons over the rose-colored cliffs. They photograph the painted churches cut into the rock by Byzantine monks. They stay in cave hotels carved from the stone of the hillsides themselves. But the surface, in Cappadocia, is only the beginning. In 1963, in the small town of Derinkuyu in the Nevşehir province, a local resident, whose name in most accounts has been lost to the retelling, was renovating his home. He was knocking down a wall in the lower level of his house, perhaps to expand a storage room, when his hammer broke through into empty space behind the wall. The hole opened into a passage. The passage led to a chamber. The chamber led to a stairway descending into the darkness. He had broken into a city. What was discovered beneath that house and explored over the following years by Turkish archaeologists would prove to be one of the most astonishing engineering achievements of the ancient world. The Derinkuyu Underground City, a vast multi-level complex carved entirely from solid volcanic rock, descending more than 85 meters into the earth, the equivalent of an 18-story building reaching downward instead of up. 18 levels in total, though only the upper 8 are open to visitors today. Capable, by conservative estimate, of housing 20,000 people for extended periods. Together with their livestock, their food supplies, their oil lamps, and everything else needed to sustain life in the absolute absence of sunlight. The scale alone defies easy comprehension. Derinkuyu contains living quarters, kitchens, wineries, oil presses, stables for animals, schools, storage rooms, communal halls, wells, and a cruciform church on one of the lower levels. Ventilation shafts, cut precisely through the rock, descend the full height of the city, providing fresh air to even the deepest chambers. 52 of these shafts have been identified. They are so well designed that air still circulates through the city today, more than 1,000 years after it was last regularly inhabited. There are tunnels connecting Derinkuyu to other underground cities in the region, and there are many such cities. More than 200 underground complexes have been identified in Cappadocia, some of them small refuges of a few rooms, others vast networks rivaling Derinkuyu in scale. The nearby city of Kaymakla is connected to Derinkuyu by a tunnel almost 9 kilometers long. The two cities together may have housed more than 50,000 people in times of crisis. And throughout the complex, at intervals along the corridors, are the doors. Massive circular stones, carved from the same volcanic rock as the city itself, set into grooves in the walls. Each door weighs between 200 and 500 kilograms. They could be rolled into place from inside, sealing off entire sections of the city, and they could only be moved from one side. Anyone trapped on the wrong side of such a door would find it impossible to push through. The doors were defensive, designed to be closed against an enemy that the inhabitants of Derinkuyu, for whatever reason, profoundly feared. Mainstream historians have offered a coherent picture of the city's later history. By the Byzantine period in the first millennium AD, the underground cities of Cappadocia were used by early Christian communities seeking refuge from persecution. First from Roman authorities, later from Arab raiders during the long centuries of warfare between the Byzantine Empire and the expanding caliphates. The cruciform church at Derinkuyu, the early Christian symbols carved into some of the chamber walls, and the historical records of monastic communities in the region all support this picture. We know, with reasonable confidence, that Derinkuyu was used as a place of refuge during the 8th and 9th centuries AD. But the city was not built then. The Byzantine Christians inherited Derinkuyu. They expanded it, they modified it, they added their churches and their crosses. But the underlying complex, the deep shafts, the lower levels, the original layout of tunnels and chambers, was already there when they arrived. How old, then, is Derinkuyu? This is where the certainty fades. The most cautious estimates, based on stylistic comparisons with surface architecture and on indirect references in ancient sources, place the original construction in the Phrygian period, roughly the 8th to 7th centuries BC. Some scholars push the date back further, to the Hittite era, the 2nd millennium BC, citing certain artifacts and architectural features that resemble Hittite work. The Hittites are known to have ruled this region of Anatolia, and their texts describe seeking refuge underground from invaders. A few researchers have proposed dates older still, much older. They point to the difficulty of carving such a complex with the tools available to Bronze Age societies, to the engineering precision of the ventilation system, and to the fact that no historical source from any of the candidate periods describes the construction of the city itself. Like the Roman dodecahedrons, Derinkuyu seems to appear in the record fully formed, without the documentation that should accompany so massive an undertaking. Some have wondered whether the original excavation might predate even the Hittites, reaching back into the deepest antiquity of Anatolian civilization, into a period before writing, when peoples we know nothing about may have built things we still struggle to explain. What were they hiding from? What was so terrible, so persistent, so feared, that an entire civilization chose to dig itself into the bones of the earth rather than face it on the surface? The doors hint at an answer. They were carved to be closed from the inside. They were carved to keep something out. Whether that something was an army, an invader, a climate catastrophe, or something else entirely, we do not know. The records, if they ever existed, are gone. Today, electric lights illuminate the upper levels of Derinkuyu. Visitors descend the stairs. They duck through the low passages. They pass the great rolling doors, frozen now in their grooves. They reach a certain depth, and they are turned back. The lower levels remain closed. Some have never been mapped at all. Beneath the small town of Derinkuyu, beneath the houses and the shops and the streets, the city continues downward. How far? No one is entirely certain. What lies in its deepest chambers, no one has yet seen. A man swung a hammer at the wall of his basement, and a city answered. How many other walls, in how many other basements, have not yet been struck? A city that grew downward, into the bones of the earth. A people who feared something so profoundly that they hollowed out the rock beneath their own feet. Sometimes the ancients hid from what was above, and sometimes, by contrast, they reached toward it, building outward, upward, across the open landscape, in patterns so deliberate and so vast that even today, walking among them, the eye cannot quite take in the whole. Travel west, far west, across the breadth of Europe, to the rocky Atlantic coast of France, to the southern shore of Brittany, where the land ends in low cliffs and salt marshes, and the sea stretches gray and unbroken toward the horizon. The wind here is constant. It bends the gorse and the heather. It carries the smell of brine across fields that, in any other part of Europe, might be ordinary farmland. But these fields are not ordinary. These fields are haunted by stone. Near the small coastal village of Karnak, in the department of Morbihan, more than 3,000 standing stones rise from the earth. Not in a single circle, like Stonehenge. Not in a confined sacred precinct. They stand in long, parallel rows, alignments, the French call them, stretching for kilometers across the gentle hills of the countryside. Row after row, stone after stone. Some no taller than a child's waist, others looming 4 meters high. The largest weighs more than 300 tons. There are several distinct alignments at Karnak, each given its own name by the local tradition. The Mennik alignment contains over 1,000 stones, arranged in 11 roughly parallel rows extending for more than a kilometer. The Kermario alignment contains another 1,000 in 10 rows. The Kurleskin, the Petit Mennik, and others continue the pattern, the rows broken only by farms, by roads, by the occasional cluster of trees. In total, the alignments cover an area of roughly 4 square kilometers. They are the largest concentration of standing stones anywhere on Earth, and they are old. Radiocarbon dating of organic material recovered from beneath the stones places their construction at roughly 4,500 BC, with the major phases of erection continuing for nearly 2,000 years afterward. The stones at Karnak are older than the pyramids of Egypt. They are older than the great ziggurats of Mesopotamia. They are older than writing. They were raised by a people whose name we do not know, whose language we cannot reconstruct, whose history exists only in the things they built and the bones they left behind. The construction itself is staggering. The stones are local granite, quarried from outcrops scattered across the region. Some were transported considerable distances, several kilometers in some cases, to be raised in their final positions. They were shaped, at least partially, by hand. The largest among them, called the Grand Menhir Brise, lies broken on the ground at nearby Locmariaquer. Standing upright, it would have reached more than 20 meters into the sky and weighed an estimated 340 tons. It is among the largest stones ever raised by a human hand in the entire history of the European continent. The Neolithic people who built Karnak had no metal tools. They had no wheels. They had no draft animals strong enough to haul stones of this magnitude. They had only ropes, levers, wooden rollers, and the labor of their own bodies, organized across generations to complete a project whose final form perhaps no single one of them ever lived to see. What were the alignments for? This is the question that has occupied scholars, antiquarians, and travelers since the stones first attracted serious attention in the early modern period. And no satisfying answer has yet been given. Local folklore offered the earliest explanation. According to medieval Breton legend, the stones were a Roman legion pursuing the early Christian Saint Cornelius. Trapped against the sea, the saint turned to face his pursuers and with a wave of his hand transformed them into stone. Soldiers frozen mid-march, ranks intact, their petrified columns left to mark the place of their punishment. The legend is charming and almost certainly false, but it captures something true about the visual experience of the alignments. Walking among the rows even today, one cannot escape the sense that the stones are organized, that they are facing in a particular direction, that they are moving somehow in a column that has only paused. Mainstream archaeology has proposed a number of more sober explanations. The most widely accepted is that the alignments are ceremonial, that they served as processional routes for religious rituals whose nature has been lost. The stones in this reading marked sacred pathways. Worshippers walked between them, perhaps in connection with funerary rites, with seasonal festivals, with rites of passage from one stage of life to another. Several of the alignments terminate at large enclosures or burial mounds, lending support to this interpretation. Others have proposed astronomical functions. Some researchers have argued that the raus are aligned to mark the positions of the rising and setting sun at the solstices and equinoxes, or to track the more complex movements of the moon through its 18.5-year cycle. Certain alignments, when surveyed carefully, do appear to point toward astronomical events. Whether this is by design, or whether it is the natural consequence of building long parallel rows in a landscape where the sun must rise somewhere, is a matter of continuing debate. Still, others have looked at the sheer scale of the project and asked harder questions. The labor required to quarry, transport, and erect 3,000 massive stones is almost beyond modern comprehension. Estimates range into the millions of person-hours. This was a society of farmers and fishermen living in small villages along the coast. What organizing force, what authority, what shared belief was powerful enough to mobilize such effort across so many generations? And what reward did they expect, in this life or any other, for an undertaking on so vast a scale? A few researchers working at the edges of accepted scholarship have wondered whether the alignments encode something else. A map, perhaps, of a landscape we cannot recognize. A diagram of energies, magnetic, geological, or otherwise, that move beneath the surface of the earth. A signal, intended to be visible from a great height, in a way that the people walking among the stones could not themselves perceive. The stones do, in fact, sit along faults in the underlying granite bedrock, and there is a long tradition of folk belief associating them with currents, with healing waters, with forces that gather where the rock breaks. The wind moves softly across the fields. The stones have stood for 6,000 years and more. They have outlasted the people who raised them. They have outlasted the languages those people spoke. They have outlasted every empire that has risen and fallen in the lands beyond Brittany, the Celts, the Romans, the Franks, the kingdoms of medieval Europe, the modern nations that came after. They will outlast us. What were they trying to say? And to whom? Stones raised in long, patient rows by the hands of farmers and fishermen. Stones that, even now, defy our understanding of why so much labor was invested in so silent a purpose. But the megalith builders of ancient Brittany were not alone. On the far side of the world, across the Atlantic, across the equator, high in a place where the air is thin and the sky burns blue at midday, another people raised stones of their own. And what they did to those stones, the cuts, the joins, the impossible precision, has troubled engineers for more than a century. Travel south, far south, across the Caribbean and the green forests of the Amazon basin, into the long spine of the Andes Mountains, to modern Bolivia, to the high plateau called the Altiplano, where the land flattens into a vast, treeless expanse at nearly 4,000 meters above sea level. The air here is so thin that visitors arriving from lower altitudes often gasp for breath. The sun is fierce. The nights are cold. To the west, the snow-capped peaks of the Cordillera Real rise into the sky. To the south, just over 20 kilometers away, lies the southern shore of Lake Titicaca, the highest navigable lake in the world. It is here, on this windswept plateau, that the ruins of an ancient city stretch across the tawny grass. Tiahuanaco, or Tiwanaku, as it is sometimes spelled in the indigenous Aymara of the region. Its name means, in some translations, the place where the sun was born. By the time the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century, Tiahuanaco had already been abandoned for nearly 500 years. The Inca, who themselves controlled this region at the time of the conquest, did not build it. They had inherited it as a place of ancient power and reverence. When the Spanish chronicler Pedro Chiesa de Leon visited the site in 1549, he asked the local people who had built it. The answer he received, recorded in his chronicles, was striking. The local people did not know. They said the city had been built before the time of the Incas. by a people whose memory had been lost. Some said it had been built in a single night, by giants. Others said it had been built before the sun was placed in the sky, been built before the sun was placed in the sky. These are folk traditions, of course. They are not history in the strict sense, but they reflect a basic fact that modern archaeology has confirmed. Tiahuanaco is old. Mainstream dating, based on radiocarbon analysis of organic material recovered from the site, places its major construction phases between roughly 200 AD and 1000 AD, with earlier occupation extending back to perhaps 1500 BC. At its height, in the 7th and 8th centuries AD, Tiahuanaco was the capital of an empire that controlled much of the southern Andes. A sophisticated populous civilization that built monumental architecture, developed extensive trade networks, and supported a population of tens of thousands at the heart of its capital alone. This much is established. What is not established, what remains, after a century and a half of investigation, profoundly uncertain, is how exactly the people of Tiahuanaco did some of what they did. Walk through the ruins today. The wind moves across the dry earth. Visitors arrive in small groups, blinking against the high-altitude sun. They pass through the great gate carved with the figure of the staff god, the central deity of the Tiahuanacan religion. They walk among the platforms of the Acapana, a stepped pyramid that once rose 17 meters above the plain. They approach the Kalasasaya, a vast rectangular enclosure whose walls are formed by upright stone pillars set into the ground at regular intervals. And then, scattered across the site, they encounter the stones themselves. The stones at Tiahuanaco are not, in the main, the rough boulders of so much megalithic construction. Many of them have been worked, cut, shaped. Some of them have been finished with a level of precision that, to a modern eye, looks impossible. There are blocks of andesite, a hard volcanic stone, far more difficult to work than limestone or sandstone, whose surfaces are flat to within a few millimeters across spans of more than a meter. There are joins between blocks where two cut stones meet so closely that a sheet of paper cannot be slipped into the seam. There are right angles, cut into massive blocks, whose corners are sharp and clean and unmistakably deliberate. There are interior channels and grooves carved into the surfaces of certain stones, running in straight lines for considerable distances, with no apparent functional purpose. There are stones into which rectangular niches have been cut, the inside corners of those niches forming clean 90-degree angles, as if shaped by a router or a milling machine. And there are the H-blocks. Among the most remarkable artifacts at Tiahuanaco are a series of stone blocks cut into precisely matching shapes, designed to interlock with one another. Each block has been carved with notches, projections, and recesses that fit, when assembled, into a continuous wall of perfectly joined stone. The faces of these blocks are flat. The angles are exact. The surfaces, in many cases, retain a smooth, almost polished finish. They look, to many who have seen them, less like the work of hammer and chisel and more like the output of a machine shop. The mainstream archaeological explanation is that the stones were worked by hand, using harder stone tools, pounders of basalt or quartzite, combined with abrasive sand, water, and an enormous investment of labor. Experimental archaeology has shown that, given enough time, this technique can produce flat surfaces and clean angles in even the hardest stone. The Egyptians, working in granite, achieved similar results with similar tools. The technique is slow, but it is not impossible. This is the orthodox view. It is reasonable, and it is supported by the available evidence. The Tiahuanacans were master craftsmen. They had the time. They had the labor. They had the cultural motivation. The work, however staggering, was within human capability. And yet, as so often in the study of these ancient sites, the questions persist. How did the Tiahuanacans cut their interior right angles in the corners of their carved niches with such consistent precision? Pounding stone with stone produces, by its nature, slightly rounded surfaces. The corners at Tiahuanaco are sharp. How did they produce the long, parallel grooves that run along the surfaces of certain blocks, evenly spaced, of constant depth. How did they achieve the flatness of their joining surfaces across stones weighing many tons without any visible deviation? Some researchers have noted that certain stones at Tiahuanaco bear what appear to be tool marks unlike anything produced by hand pounding, fine, regular striations that resemble the marks left by a rotary blade. Others have pointed to small holes drilled into the surfaces of some blocks, whose interior walls are smooth and cylindrical as if produced by a tubular drill bit. The Egyptians, too, are known to have produced such drill holes, and the technique by which they did so remains a matter of debate. At Tiahuanaco, the holes appear in stones of the hardest local andesite, a material that would dull any copper drill almost immediately and that would resist even prolonged abrasion with sand. The site presents other puzzles. The largest stones at Tiahuanaco, weighing more than 100 tons, were transported from quarries located some 40 kilometers away across difficult terrain. Some of the andesite blocks may have come from even further, from across the waters of Lake Titicaca itself, requiring transport by raft across the open lake. How a Bronze Age society without wheeled vehicles, without draft animals capable of pulling such loads, accomplished this feat is not fully understood. A few researchers working at the edges of accepted scholarship have proposed that Tiahuanaco is much older than the mainstream estimates allow. The Bolivian polymath Arthur Poznansky, working in the early 20th century, argued on the basis of astronomical alignments at the Colosseum that the original construction of the site dated to roughly 15,000 BC, placing it in the depths of the last ice age, long before any conventional date for the rise of civilization in the Americas. His arguments have been disputed by mainstream archaeologists, who hold that the alignments may simply be coincidental, or that his measurements were affected by later modifications to the site. Poznansky himself died in 1946, his theories never accepted by the scholarly mainstream, but never fully refuted either. The dating of Tiahuanaco continues to be reassessed. New excavations occasionally reveal earlier phases of construction. New analyses of the stonework occasionally reveal techniques that scholars had not previously considered. The site has not yielded all of its secrets. Today, llamas graze among the ruins. Children play in the shadow of the Gate of the Sun. Visitors press their hands against the joins between cut stones and feel for themselves how impossibly tight those seams are. The blocks have lain in their positions or near them for more than 1,000 years. Some have been moved by earthquakes. Some have been broken up for use in colonial-era construction. Some have been carried away entirely, but many remain, flat, sharp, precise, exactly as they were left. Who cut them? With what tools? And how? Working at 4,000 meters above sea level, in a climate that even today tests the lungs of any visitor not born to the altitude. Did they shape the hardest stone of the high Andes into surfaces that even modern engineers struggle to replicate? The questions stand. The wind moves across the plateau. The stones remain. Stones cut so finely that a sheet of paper cannot pass between them. Joined so tight that the seam itself becomes invisible, a hairline drawn across the surface of the rock as if by a draftsman. At Tiahuanaco, the blocks were rectangular, modular, almost industrial in their precision. But not far away, in another corner of the same Andean world, the same impossible seamlessness was achieved by a different and stranger method. Not with rectangles, not with right angles, but with stones of every conceivable shape, each one fitted to its neighbors as if grown there. Travel north from Tiahuanaco, up the long backbone of the Andes, into the heart of what was once the greatest empire of the Americas. To the highlands of southern Peru, to the city the Inca called Cusco, the navel of the world. The city we know today as Cusco, at an altitude of roughly 3,400 meters, surrounded by green valleys and terraced slopes. Cusco was the political, religious, and ceremonial capital of an empire that, at its height in the early 16th century, stretched from southern Colombia through Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and into northern Argentina and Chile. An empire of nearly 12 million subjects. An empire whose roads, fortresses, and temples remain in places almost as they were left. On the hillside above the city, looking down across the red roofs of colonial Cusco and out toward the surrounding mountains, stand the ruins of a vast complex of stone walls. The Spanish chroniclers called it Sacsayhuaman, a Quechua name whose meaning has been variously translated as satisfied falcon, speckled head, or place where the hawk is satisfied. The site sits on a high plateau just north of the old city, occupying a position of enormous strategic and ceremonial importance. From its terraces, one can see for many kilometers in every direction. What survives at Sacsayhuaman today is only a fraction of what once stood. The Spanish, after the conquest, used the site as a quarry for the construction of colonial Cusco. The smaller stones, the more easily moved blocks, were carried down the hill and incorporated into churches, palaces, and houses in the city below. What we see now are the foundations and the lower courses, the pieces too large, too heavy, or too perfectly fitted to be dislodged. Even after this systematic destruction, what remains is among the most extraordinary stonework anywhere in the world. The site is dominated by three immense zigzagging walls, built in parallel, rising in tiered terraces along the northern edge of the plateau. The walls extend for more than 400 meters in length. The lowest and largest of them stands roughly 6 meters high, though some individual stones rise higher still. The walls are not built of small, uniform blocks. They are built of boulders, massive, irregular, polygonal stones, some weighing more than 100 tons, the largest estimated at around 200 tons, fitted together with a precision that has astonished every observer who has ever stood before them. Each stone has been carved with multiple faces. Some have 5 sides, some have 8, some have 12. One famous stone, embedded in the central wall, has been counted as having 12 distinct angles, 12 separate corners where its surface meets the surfaces of the neighboring stones. And every single one of those corners fits exactly into the matching corner of an adjacent block. There are no gaps. There is no mortar. There is no filler. The stones meet, plane to plane, edge to edge, in a join so close that even today, after centuries of earthquakes and weathering, a knife blade cannot be inserted between them. Walk along the base of the walls. Run a hand across the surface of a stone weighing as much as a battleship's gun turret. Trace the seam where it meets the next block. The line vanishes under your fingers. The stones appear at certain angles to flow into one another, to be not separate boulders at all, but a single mass, frozen in the act of becoming. The mainstream archaeological view holds that Sacsayhuaman was built by the Inca during the reign of Pachacuti, roughly between 1438 and 1471 A.D. Spanish chronicles record that the construction took decades, employed tens of thousands of laborers, and involved transport of stones from quarries located several kilometers away. The basic facts of the site's construction in this view are reasonably well documented. The Inca were superb engineers. They had the labor, they had the time, they had the cultural motivation, and the imperial command structure to undertake projects of this scale. This is not seriously in dispute. What is in dispute, or at least what has resisted full explanation, is the technique. How exactly did the Inca achieve the seamless polygonal joins at Sacsayhuaman? How did they carve a stone weighing 100 tons with 12 precisely matching angles, each one fitted to the corresponding angle of a different stone weighing perhaps 80 tons, or 70 or 50? How did they shape the boulders so that the irregular faces of one block match the irregular faces of its neighbors with such tightness that no light passes between them? The conventional answer is patient, repetitive labor. Stones were shaped by pounding with hammer stones, typically tools of harder stone such as basalt or quartzite, and abraded with sand and water. The Inca, the explanation goes, would shape one block to its desired form, then carefully test it against its neighbors, removing material a fraction of a millimeter at a time until the surfaces matched. The process was iterative. It was slow. It consumed enormous human effort, but it was, in principle, achievable with the tools and materials available to a Bronze Age society. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that such techniques can produce close-fitting joins between stones. Some modern stoneworkers, using only hammerstones and abrasives, have managed to recreate something resembling Inca masonry, though typically on a far smaller scale and with simpler shapes than the great polygonal blocks of Sacsayhuaman. This perhaps is the limit of the orthodox explanation. It tells us that the work was possible. It does not fully tell us how it was done. Some researchers have looked at the walls and asked harder questions. The polygonal joins in many cases are not flat surfaces meeting at simple angles. They are complex, three-dimensional interlocks, where the stones not only fit edge to edge but actually project into one another, with bumps on one stone fitting into hollows on the next. Producing such joins by trial and error, by repeatedly lifting and lowering 100-ton boulders to test their fit, would require not just labor, but engineering capabilities that strain the limits of what a society without cranes, without iron tools, without writing-based engineering plans, could plausibly have achieved. A few have proposed alternatives. Some have suggested the stones were shaped by methods now lost, perhaps by the use of plant-based softeners that temporarily made the stone malleable. There is, it must be said, no scientific evidence for such a technique. It exists only in oral traditions and in 19th century travelers' tales. But the tradition itself is persistent, and the stones do, in places, look almost as if they had been molded rather than carved. Others have suggested the original walls of Sacsayhuaman were not built by the Inca at all, that the Inca, like the Byzantines at Derinkuyu or the Egyptians of the late period at certain older sites, inherited the walls from a civilization that had come before them. According to this view, the Inca built atop the foundations of a much older megalithic culture whose engineering capabilities exceeded their own. The smaller, more conventional Inca masonry that crowns the great polygonal foundations would, in this reading, represent a later phase of construction. The Inca finishing, with their own techniques, what an earlier and more capable people had begun. The mainstream view rejects this hypothesis. There is no archaeological evidence, in the conventional sense, of a pre-Inca civilization at Sacsayhuaman capable of such work. But absence of evidence, as is often pointed out, is not evidence of absence. The Spanish destruction of the site, the centuries of subsequent quarrying, the loss of indigenous oral histories during the colonial period, all of these have made the deeper history of Sacsayhuaman difficult, perhaps impossible, to fully reconstruct. The local Quechua people, when asked who built the Great Walls, have sometimes answered, even into modern times, that the walls were built by the gods, or by giants, or by people who came before the Inca and whose names are no longer remembered. These are not, of course, archaeological statements. They are folk traditions. But folk traditions, in regions with deep, continuous habitation, sometimes preserve memories that the written record has lost. The walls remain on the hillside above Cusco. Tourists climb the path from the city below. They walk along the great zigzagging terraces. They stop at the famous 12-angled stone, its photograph one of the most reproduced images of any pre-Columbian site in the Americas. They lean close to the seams. They run their fingers along the joins. They ask the same question that has been asked by every visitor since the Spanish first laid eyes on the walls nearly 500 years ago. How? And underneath that question, quieter, more disturbing, the deeper one. Who exactly did this? And what did they know that we have not yet rediscovered? Stones cut into 12 corners and fitted together without mortar. Boulders shaped to the will of an unknown engineer, set into walls that have stood for centuries against earthquakes and conquerors and time. The ancient peoples of the Americas, in places we cannot fully account for, achieved feats of stoneworking that continue to puzzle us. And sometimes they did so not in walls, not in temples, not in fortresses, but in shapes that have no obvious purpose at all. Shapes that, by their geometry alone, seem to ask a question. Shapes that, when you walk among them, feel less like artifacts and more like answers to a problem we have not yet learned to name. Travel north from the high Andes, down through the rainforests of Colombia, into the narrow isthmus of Central America, to Costa Rica, to the southwestern province of Punta Arenas, where the land rolls down from the volcanic Central Highlands toward the Pacific coast, and the Dikis Delta opens out into a humid plain crisscrossed by rivers. This is a region of palm plantations and pasture today, of small farming towns and quiet roads. But beneath the surface of the modern landscape lies the trace of an older one, the territory of the Dikis culture, a pre-Columbian people who flourished in this part of Costa Rica from roughly 600 AD to 1500 AD, before disappearing in the upheavals that followed European contact. In the 1930s, the United Fruit Company began clearing forests in the Dikis Delta to expand its banana plantations. Workers cutting through the dense undergrowth, hacking at vines and felling trees, began to encounter something strange. Stones. But not the rough boulders one might expect to find on a forest floor. Spheres. Almost perfectly round stone balls, scattered across the landscape and partially buried in the earth. Some no larger than an orange. Others enormous, over 2 meters in diameter and weighing more than 15 tons. They appeared in clearings, in riverbeds, on hillsides, beneath the soil, in arrangements that seemed deliberate, but were not at first clearly understood. Workers rolled some of them aside to clear the land. Others were dynamited, broken open in the mistaken belief that they might contain gold or treasure. Many were destroyed before anyone realized that they might be archaeologically significant. By the time scholarly attention finally arrived, dozens had been damaged or lost, but hundreds more remained. The first serious investigation was conducted by an American archaeologist named Doris Stone, who began documenting the spheres in the 1940s and brought them to the attention of the wider academic community. Subsequent fieldwork, conducted intermittently over the following decades, has identified more than 300 of these stone spheres scattered across the southern lowlands of Costa Rica. They have come to be known as Las Bolas, the balls, or in formal usage, the stone spheres of the Dikis. They are unique. Nothing quite like them, in scale, in number, or in geometric perfection, has been found anywhere else in the pre-Columbian Americas. The smaller spheres are typically a few centimeters across. The medium-sized ones range from roughly 30 centimeters to a meter in diameter. The largest are extraordinary, nearly perfect spheres of stone, 2.5 meters across, weighing as much as 16 tons. The geometric precision of the larger spheres has been measured with modern instruments. Many of them deviate from a true sphere by less than 2 centimeters across their entire surface, a level of accuracy that, for a hand-shaped stone object weighing several tons, is remarkable. Most of the spheres are made of gabbro, a hard, dark, igneous rock chemically similar to basalt. A few are made of limestone or sandstone. The gabbro itself does not occur in the Dikis Delta where the spheres are found. The nearest known sources of gabbro are in the Talamanca mountain range, located dozens of kilometers to the east. The stone, in other words, was quarried in one place, transported across substantial distances, and then shaped somehow into spheres of extraordinary precision. The dating of the spheres remains uncertain. Direct dating is impossible. Stone, of course, cannot be radiocarbon dated, and the spheres themselves contain no organic material. But archaeological context, in the rare cases where spheres have been found in undisturbed associations with other artifacts, suggests that most were created between roughly 600 AD and 1500 AD, with the largest and most precisely worked examples likely belonging to the later end of that range. The Dikis people, who almost certainly produced them, were a sophisticated society. They built large villages with houses arranged around central plazas. They worked gold into elaborate ornaments. They produced fine pottery, polished stone tools, and a rich corpus of ceremonial objects. They were, by every measure, a settled and capable culture. But they did not write. They left no inscriptions explaining what the spheres were for. They left no diagrams of how the spheres were made. By the time European explorers arrived in the region in the 16th century, the Dikis culture had already declined, its population scattered, its knowledge fragmented. Whatever oral traditions might have explained the spheres were largely lost in the upheavals of the colonial period. What remains is the stones themselves, and the questions they ask. The mainstream archaeological view holds that the spheres were shaped by the slow, patient labor of skilled artisans using simpler stone tools, pounders of harder rock, abrasives of sand and water, perhaps fire to weaken the surface, and then water to crack it. Working a roughly spherical boulder over weeks or months, removing material from any high spots, gradually approximating a true sphere through repeated measurement and correction. The technique is plausible. Experimental archaeology has shown that small spheres can be produced this way. The precision on this view is the result of an enormous investment of time and the development, over generations, of specialized craft knowledge. This is a reasonable explanation. It is supported by the existence of partially completed spheres at certain sites, which appear to show the shaping process in mid-progress. It is supported by the survival of pounding tools associated with sphere production. It is supported by the broader fact that the Dikis were demonstrably capable of fine stonework in other contexts. And yet questions remain. How did the artisans achieve such consistent precision across spheres of such varying sizes? The largest spheres, weighing many tons, are spherical to within 2 centimeters. To verify the geometry of a sphere of this size by eye alone, the artisan would need to view it from many angles, ideally from a distance, ideally with some method of measuring deviation from a true curve. What method did they use? How did they roll a 16-ton sphere to inspect it? How did they determine with such accuracy where to remove material to bring it closer to perfection? How were the spheres transported? The Gabbro source in the Talamanca Mountains lies dozens of kilometers from the Dikis Delta, across rugged terrain dissected by rivers. Moving a 16-ton block of stone over such distances by any pre-industrial means is an enormous undertaking. The Dikis had no draft animals. They had no wheels. Whatever method they used has left no clear archaeological trace. And what were the spheres for? This is, perhaps, the deepest question of all. Surveys of the original locations where the spheres were found, many of them now disturbed by agricultural development, have revealed that the stones were often arranged in deliberate patterns. Lines, triangles, curves. Some appear to have been positioned to align with cardinal directions, or with astronomical events such as the rising of the sun at the solstices. Some were arranged in clusters near important habitation sites, as if marking the entrances or boundaries of significant places. Others were placed in apparent isolation, in the middle of fields or beside rivers, with no obvious associations. Various interpretations have been offered. The spheres may have been status objects, displayed by chiefs and elite families to demonstrate wealth and power. They may have been ceremonial markers, used in religious rituals whose meaning is lost. They may have served astronomical or calendrical functions, marking the passage of seasons in agricultural cycles. They may have been territorial boundary markers between rival communities. They may have been all of these things, at different times and in different places. A few researchers working at the edges of accepted scholarship have proposed more speculative possibilities. The geometric precision of the spheres, combined with their occasional astronomical alignments, has led some to suggest that they served as components in an unknown system of measurement or calculation. Perhaps a way of mapping the heavens onto the earth, perhaps a tool for predicting events whose nature we no longer understand. Others have noted that certain ancient cultures around the world have produced precisely shaped spheres of stone, far smaller than those of Costa Rica, but mysterious in their own right, and have wondered whether the Dikis spheres represent a local expression of some older, more widespread tradition whose origins are deeper than the archaeological record allows us to see. Today, many of the spheres have been removed from their original locations. They sit in plazas, in front of museums, in the gardens of government buildings, in the courtyards of homes throughout Costa Rica. Some have been declared UNESCO World Heritage Objects. The few that remain in their original contexts are protected as archaeological reserves, surrounded by fences and informational signs. Visitors approach them. They walk around them. They press their palms against the smooth, dark surfaces. They notice how perfectly the curves continue, how impossible it seems that something so geometrically pure could have been made by hand. They ask their guides. The guides offer the standard explanations, but the spheres themselves do not speak. Why this shape, of all shapes? Why so many of them, so carefully made by a culture that left so little else of comparable precision? What were the Dakish trying to hold in their hands when they shaped a sphere out of mountain stone? And what, if anything, did they believe it would hold for them in return? A sphere of stone, shaped by an unknown hand for an unknown purpose. A perfect curve, holding its silence in the green stillness of the Costa Rican forest. Geometry, in the ancient world, sometimes seems to have been a language all its own, a way of saying something that words could not. And nowhere, perhaps, is that language more arresting than in the lowlands of Mexico, where another ancient people, working in the same era of the same hemisphere, took a different shape and pursued it to its limit. Not a sphere, not an abstraction, a face. Travel north, up the long curve of Central America, into the sweltering coastal plains of southern Mexico, to the modern states of Veracruz and Tabasco, where the Gulf of Mexico washes against low tropical shores and the land rolls inland through swamps, rivers, and dense lowland forest. The climate is hot and wet. The soil is rich. Mosquitoes thicken the air at dusk. It is not, on the face of it, a likely cradle for one of the most influential civilizations of the ancient Americas. And yet it was here, in this humid country, that the first great culture of Mesoamerica took shape. A culture so foundational that later peoples, including the Maya and the Aztec, drew on its imagery, its religion, and its art for nearly 2,000 years. We call them the Olmec. The name is not their own. It was given to them by later peoples, and it means, in Nahuatl, people of the rubber country. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know what language they spoke. We do not know, with any certainty, where they came from. They appeared in the archaeological record around 1500 BC, established large ceremonial centers at sites called San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes, dominated the cultural life of southern Mexico for nearly 1,000 years, and then, around 400 BC, declined and dispersed, leaving behind only the bones of their cities and the staggering monuments they had carved from stone. Among those monuments are the heads. The first one was discovered in 1862 by a peasant clearing land near the village of Tres Zapotes in Veracruz. He had been digging in a field, removing what he assumed was a buried boulder, when he uncovered a curved, smooth surface of dark stone. As he dug further, the surface revealed itself. A human face. Massive. Powerful. Carved in the round from a single block of basalt. The peasant, astonished, called for help. The find was reported in the local press. Antiquarians arrived to investigate. And so began, more than a century and a half ago, the slow recognition that the lowlands of southern Mexico contained something extraordinary. Since that first discovery, 17 colossal heads have been recovered from 4 major Olmec sites. 10 from San Lorenzo, 4 from La Venta, 2 from Tres Zapotes, and 1 from Rancho La Cobada. They range in height from 1.5 meters to over 3.5 meters. They weigh between 6 and 50 tons. The largest of them stands as tall as a single-story building. Each head is unique. Each represents an individual with distinct facial features, distinct expressions, distinct headdresses or helmets covering the crown of the skull. The faces are flat-nosed, full-lipped, heavy-lidded. The eyes look out from beneath the brim of their headgear with an expression that has been described variously as serene, severe, watchful, melancholy. The carving is masterful. The proportions are confident. Every head has the unmistakable presence of a portrait, of a real person, observed from life, rendered in stone with the intent that he be remembered. This is the conventional interpretation. The heads are portraits of Olmec rulers, depicted in the ceremonial helmets they wore in life. The headdresses, sometimes resembling leather caps with chin straps, sometimes adorned with claws or jaguar paws, are now generally interpreted as the headgear worn by Olmec elites in the ritual ballgame, a sacred sport that was central to Mesoamerican religious life. Each head in this view commemorated a particular king, a particular dynasty, a particular moment in the long history of Olmec power. The interpretation is reasonable. It accounts for the individuality of the heads, for the consistency of their basic form, and for the prominent placement of the heads in Olmec ceremonial centers. It is supported by parallels with later Mesoamerican cultures, in which ruler portraits and ballgame imagery played central roles. And yet, as so often, the explanation does not entirely close the case. Consider the stone itself. The colossal heads are carved from basalt, a hard, dense, volcanic rock. The Olmec ceremonial centers where the heads have been found are located in the lowland alluvial plains, where there is no basalt. The nearest source of suitable basalt is in the Tuxtla Mountains, a volcanic range that rises from the coastal plain some distance inland. The boulders from which the heads were carved have been sourced by geological analysis to a specific location. Cerro Chintepec, a particular volcanic peak in the Tuxtlas. The distance from Cerro Chintepec to the Olmec Center at San Lorenzo is roughly 90 kilometers. The distance to La Venta is over 150. These distances were crossed by transporting the unworked basalt boulders, some of them weighing 20, 40, 50 tons, from the mountains to the ceremonial centers, where they were then carved into the heads we see today. The transport route would have required moving the stones across rivers, through swamps, and over difficult terrain. The Olmec had no wheels. They had no draft animals. They had only their own labor, their own ingenuity, and whatever knowledge of leverage, flotation, and traction they had developed over generations. How they did it remains genuinely uncertain. The most widely accepted theory holds that the boulders were transported overland by means of wooden rollers and ramps, and across water on rafts of bound logs. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that such methods can, in principle, move very heavy stones over long distances, given enough labor and enough time. But no Olmec rafts have ever been found. No remains of transport infrastructure have been identified. The route from the Tuxtla quarries to San Lorenzo, when surveyed in modern times, presents stretches that would have been formidable obstacles to any pre-industrial moving operation. Then there are the faces themselves. The features of the colossal heads have, since their first discovery, attracted commentary that goes well beyond ordinary archaeological description. The flat noses, the full lips, the broad cheekbones. Many observers have noted that these features do not closely resemble the typical facial features of indigenous Mesoamerican peoples. Some early researchers examining the heads in the late 19th and early 20th centuries suggested that the faces appeared to them to be African. Others have proposed Polynesian connections, or Asiatic ones. The argument has been controversial, sometimes deeply so, and is generally rejected by mainstream archaeology, which holds that the heads represent the ordinary range of variation within the indigenous population of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. The mainstream position has substantial support. Genetic analysis of populations descended from ancient Mesoamerican peoples shows no clear evidence of African or Polynesian ancestry. Stylistic analysis of the heads, comparing them with other Olmec sculpture, shows continuity within a recognizable Olmec artistic tradition. The features that some observers find non-indigenous can be explained by the conventions of Olmec portraiture, by the proportions imposed by carving such large stones, and by the simple fact that ancient peoples did not all look alike. But the question persists, in part because the heads do not look quite like anything else. They have a presence that resists easy categorization. They have, to many who have stood before them, a foreignness, a sense of looking at faces from somewhere else, even if that somewhere cannot be named. Whether this is a real signal encoded in the stone by the original carvers, or whether it is the projection of modern observers searching for the exotic in the unfamiliar, is a question that has not been settled. A few researchers working at the edges of accepted scholarship have gone further. They have proposed that the Olmec may represent the descendants of transoceanic visitors, sailors from Africa, from Asia, from the Mediterranean, who reached the Americas thousands of years before any conventionally recognized contact. The colossal heads in this view are portraits of those visitors, preserved in stone by a people who remembered where their leaders had come from. Mainstream archaeology dismisses these claims, citing the lack of supporting genetic, linguistic, or material evidence. The argument continues in popular literature with little resolution. What is certain is this: the Olmec rose, seemingly without precedent, in the lowlands of southern Mexico more than 3,000 years ago. They built cities. They carved massive heads. They influenced every civilization that came after them in Mesoamerica. And then they vanished, leaving behind a few hundred sculptures, a few thousand other artifacts, and not a single written word that we have yet been able to read. The heads stand today in museums and parks across Mexico. Visitors approach them in the early morning, when the heat has not yet built. They walk around the great basalt faces. They look up at the heavy-lidded eyes. They notice the chin straps, the helmets, the broad mouths set in expressions of impossible composure. Who were they? Where did they come from? And what did they see looking out from those faces that the rest of us have not yet learned to recognize? Faces carved from volcanic stone, looking out across centuries with expressions we cannot quite read. The Olmec, like the makers of the Phaistos disc, left behind no writing we can decipher. And so their inner world remains, in the most literal sense, mute. But not all the unsolved messages of antiquity belong to cultures so distant from our own. Some come from a time we know well, from a place we have mapped in detail, from a culture whose every other artifact we can read with ease. And yet, in the middle of that familiar landscape, sits a single object that, for more than 600 years, no one, not the finest cryptographers of intelligence agencies, not the most sophisticated computer algorithms, not the most patient and brilliant scholars of medieval languages, has been able to understand. Travel north and east, out of the Americas, across the Atlantic, into the heart of late medieval Europe. The continent, in the early 15th century, is emerging from the shadows of the Great Plague. Universities are flourishing in Paris, in Bologna, in Oxford. The first stirrings of what will become the Renaissance are visible in the city-states of northern Italy. Manuscripts are being copied in monastic scriptoria across Christendom. Books in this era are precious objects, handwritten, hand-illuminated, often on parchment made from the prepared skins of sheep or calves. Each one represents months or years of labor by trained scribes. It is in this setting, sometime between roughly 1404 and 1438 AD, that someone, somewhere in Europe, sat down and produced a book that has defied every attempt to decode it. The manuscript is small by medieval standards, about 23 centimeters tall, 16 wide. It contains, in its current form, 240 pages, though it is generally believed that some pages have been lost over the centuries, a few of them recently enough that their absence is documented. The pages are vellum, made from prepared animal skin. The script flows from left to right in neat lines, written in iron gall ink with a steady, practiced hand. The pages are richly illustrated, in colors that have faded but remain visible, blues and greens and reds and yellows, applied with care. And on every page, there is text, lines and lines of it, tens of thousands of words, written in an alphabet that, as far as anyone can determine, exists nowhere else in the human record. The manuscript is named for Wilfrid Voynich, a Polish-Lithuanian rare book dealer who acquired it in 1912 from a Jesuit college near Rome. Voynich brought the manuscript to wider attention, attempting unsuccessfully to identify its language and decode its contents. After his death, the manuscript passed through several owners before being donated, in 1969, to the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University, where it is held today under the catalog designation MS 408. Its provenance prior to Voynich's acquisition is partially documented. A letter found inside the manuscript, dated 1665, refers to its having been owned by the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II of Prague, who reportedly purchased it in the late 16th century for the substantial sum of 600 gold ducats. Earlier than that, the trail grows faint. What is in it? The manuscript is divided by visual and topical convention into several sections. Each section is dominated by a particular kind of illustration. The first and largest section, called the herbal, contains drawings of plants, page after page of leafy flowering specimens, each accompanied by paragraphs of text. The plants are not, in most cases, identifiable. A few resemble known species. Most do not resemble anything that grows on Earth. The illustrations are detailed, careful, and seemingly intended to be informative, as if the author expected the reader to recognize what was being depicted. But the species are unknown. The second section, called the astronomical or astrological, contains circular diagrams resembling zodiac wheels, with naked human figures arranged around their rims. The figures are mostly female. The wheels are labeled with what appear to be the months of the year, in a script that mostly resembles ordinary medieval European writing, except that the names of the months are followed by lines of the unreadable text. The third section, sometimes called the biological or balneological, is the strangest. It depicts dozens of small naked women bathing in elaborate networks of green pools connected by tubes and channels of liquid. The women are everywhere, in groups, in pairs, alone, holding objects, gesturing. The pools intertwine in ways that suggest some kind of system or process, but the nature of that process is entirely unclear. The fourth section, the cosmological, contains large fold-out diagrams of what appear to be cosmic or geographical maps, circular structures connected by pathways, with smaller circles within them, depicting buildings, towers, and what may be celestial bodies. The fifth, the pharmaceutical, returns to plant imagery, but now the plants are smaller, drawn alongside what appear to be jars or apothecary containers. The sixth and final section is the recipes section, which contains no illustrations at all, only short paragraphs of text, separated by small floral marks, page after page of them, like a cookbook or a list of formulas. And throughout, on every page, in every section, in lines that fill the spaces between the illustrations and run from margin to margin, the text. The script is unknown. The alphabet, when carefully analyzed, contains between 20 and 30 distinct characters, depending on how scholars choose to distinguish similar-looking letters. Some of the characters resemble Latin letters. Others resemble forms found in medieval shorthand, or in alchemical notation, or in Arabic numerals. But the combination, as a whole, matches nothing else. Statistical analysis of the text has revealed that it behaves in many ways like a real language. The frequency distribution of its letters follows patterns consistent with natural human writing. Certain words appear only at the beginning of paragraphs, others only at the end. Certain letter combinations are common, others impossible. The text has structure, it has rules, it has internal consistency that would be extraordinarily difficult to fake. And yet no one has ever read it. The manuscript has been studied intermittently for nearly 400 years. In the early 20th century, after Voynich brought it to public attention, professional cryptographers took up the challenge. William Friedman, the legendary American codebreaker who broke the Japanese diplomatic cipher Purple during World War II, devoted decades of his life to the manuscript. He failed. His wife, Elizabeth Friedman, herself a brilliant cryptanalyst, also worked on it for years. She failed. Teams of cryptographers from the National Security Agency, working with early computers in the 1950s and 1960s, attempted to crack it. They failed. In recent decades, machine learning algorithms and natural language processing systems have been turned on the manuscript. They have produced provocative analyses, suggestions that the underlying language might be a Romance language, an early form of Hebrew, a constructed language built on phonetic principles, an obscure dialect of Mesoamerican origin, or any of a dozen other possibilities. None of these analyses has produced a translation that scholars can verify. None of them has yielded a single sentence that, translated, makes sense in the context of the surrounding illustrations. A persistent counter-theory holds that the manuscript is a hoax, that the text is meaningless, a sequence of symbols arranged to look like writing without actually encoding anything. This theory has its proponents. It would explain why no one has ever decoded the text. It would account for the manuscript's long history of frustration. But it struggles against the statistical evidence, which suggests that the text is far too structured, too consistent, too rule-bound to be random gibberish. If the manuscript is a hoax, it is a hoax executed with extraordinary linguistic sophistication by someone who understood in the early 15th century principles of statistical linguistics that were not formally identified until the 20th. This perhaps is what makes the Voynich manuscript so disorienting. It does not exist at the edges of the historical record, in some remote desert or some lost civilization. It exists in the middle of the European Middle Ages, in a tradition of book production we understand intimately, written in an ink and on a parchment we can date with confidence. We know exactly when it was made. We know roughly where. We can hold the actual physical object in our hands today, in a climate-controlled room at Yale. We just cannot read it. Some have suggested it was written by John Dee or Edward Kelly, the English occultists who served as advisors to Rudolph II. Some have suggested it was the work of a medieval female herbalist, encoding her knowledge in a private cipher to protect it from authorities suspicious of unauthorized medical practice. Some have suggested it is the manual of a heretical sect, or the diary of a private mystical experience, or the casebook of an alchemist. Some have suggested it was written by someone outside the European tradition entirely, perhaps a traveler from the land stretching south through Palestine and Egypt, or further east, who brought a foreign system of knowledge and recorded it in a script of their own devising. A few have wondered whether the manuscript is the product of altered mental states, the work of someone in the grip of a vision, recording in a script they themselves believed had meaning, even if that meaning was inaccessible to anyone else. The illustrations in this reading are clues to a private cosmology, a vision of plants that grew only in the mind of the visionary, of pools that connected only in the inner geography of the soul. The Benecca Library has digitized every page of the manuscript and made the images freely available online. Anyone, anywhere in the world, can study them. Thousands of amateur enthusiasts and professional researchers do, every year. Periodically, someone announces that they have cracked the cipher. Each announcement is examined, debated, and ultimately dismissed. The manuscript continues to resist. 6 centuries on, the words sit on the page exactly as their author left them. The plants remain unidentified. The bathing women continue their incomprehensible rituals in their green pools. The zodiac wheels turn beneath their unreadable labels. Someone, 600 years ago, sat down with a pen, a pot of ink, and a stack of carefully prepared vellum, and wrote this. They wrote it in their own hand, in their own time, with their own intention. They believed, presumably, that what they were writing meant something. What did they want us to know? And why, after all this time, are we still unable to hear them? A book whose author wanted to be understood but cannot be. Sometimes the message is in writing, sometimes it is in the shape of a sphere, or the cut of a wall, or the proportions of a face. And sometimes, very rarely, it is in the form of a body. A small sculpted body, made of clay, found in a grave that is older than civilization itself. A body that, when you look at it, does not look entirely human, and does not look entirely animal, and makes you wonder, as so many of these objects do, what exactly the people who made it were trying to show. Travel south once more, back into the cradle of recorded history. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. We have been here before, in our examination of the Sumerian king list. But the story we are about to tell is older. Older than Sumer, older than writing, older than the great cities whose names have come down to us in the cuneiform of the Bronze Age. To find the people who made the figurines, we must go back further still, into the deepest layers of human settlement in southern Iraq, into a culture that lived and died before history began. They are called the Ubaid people. Their name comes from the modern Arabic name of a small mound in southern Iraq, Tel al-Ubaid, where the first major excavation of their culture was conducted in the early 20th century. The Ubaid culture flourished in southern Mesopotamia from roughly 5,500 BC to 4,000 BC. They were the people who first drained the marshes of the lower Tigris and Euphrates and built villages on the flat alluvial plain. They built the first monumental temples in human history. They invented the painted pottery traditions that would shape Mesopotamian art for millennia. They were, in every meaningful sense, the ancestors of the Sumerians, the foundation upon which the first civilization of the ancient Near East would be raised. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know what language they spoke. We have no writing from them because writing had not yet been invented. What we have is what they left behind in the earth: the foundations of their houses, the painted bowls of their kitchens, the bones of their dead, the mud brick remains of their temples, and a collection of small clay figurines that, since their first discovery, have unsettled almost everyone who has examined them. The figurines are small. Most are between 14 and 17 centimeters tall. They are made of clay, the same alluvial clay, dried or lightly fired, from which the Ubaid people built their houses and shaped their pottery. They have been recovered from a number of Ubaid sites across southern Iraq, including Tel al-Ubaid itself, Eridu, and Tel Awaili. They are typically found in graves, lying alongside the human remains of the buried, as if intended to accompany the dead into whatever lay beyond. And they look, to a modern eye, like nothing else in the prehistoric record. The figurines depict humanoid figures, upright, with 2 arms, 2 legs, and a single head. The bodies are slender, almost elongated, with broad shoulders that taper to narrow waists. Some of the figures are clearly female, with breasts shown in delicate clay relief. A few hold infants to their chests, in postures of nursing or cradling. Others are male, with the genitalia indicated. Most are nude, though some bear traces of painted decoration that may once have represented clothing or body markings. The arms hang at the sides or rest against the hips, in poses of formal stillness. But the heads are not human. The faces are long, narrow, and reptilian. The skulls are elongated backward, sloping into a pronounced point or ridge. The eyes are huge, almond-shaped, slit-pupilled, set wide on the sides of the head. The mouths are thin, lipless, set in expressions that range from neutral to almost smug. The noses are flat or only barely defined. The features, taken together, resemble nothing so much as the head of a lizard set atop a human body, or the head of a creature that is neither one nor the other, but something in between. They have been called by various researchers the Ubaid lizard figurines, the Ophidian figurines, the reptilian goddess statuettes. The names attempt to describe what the eyes resist: the disorienting fact that these objects, made nearly 7,000 years ago by farmers in the marshes of southern Iraq, depict beings who are not entirely of this world. The mainstream archaeological interpretation has settled on a few cautious explanations. Most scholars hold that the figurines are religious, depictions of deities or spiritual beings worshipped by the Ubaid people. The reptilian features in this view are stylistic conventions rather than literal representations. Lizards and snakes were powerful symbolic creatures throughout the ancient Near East, associated with renewal, with rebirth, with the underworld, with chthonic forces beneath the earth. The Ubaid people, living in marshes thick with reptiles, may have developed a religious iconography that drew on these animals as visual metaphors for divine power. The figurines on this reading are gods, or goddesses, or ancestral spirits whose forms were imagined in the mingled features of human and serpent. A second related interpretation holds that the figurines represent a fertility cult. The female figures with their nursing infants would, in this reading, be embodiments of a maternal deity, a goddess of birth, of growth, of the renewal of life, depicted with the symbolic features of a creature associated with regeneration. Snakes shed their skins and emerge new. Lizards regrow their tails. The connection to an agricultural people obsessed with the cycles of fertility and decay would have been natural. A third interpretation, somewhat more cautious, simply observes that we do not understand the visual conventions of pre-literate cultures very well. The Ubaid people may have had stylistic norms that prized exaggerated facial features for entirely aesthetic or symbolic reasons we can no longer reconstruct. The figurines may have been intended to look human in the conventions of their time, even if they look strange to us now. We are, in this view, projecting our own aesthetic assumptions back onto people whose visual world was entirely different from our own. These are reasonable explanations. They are supported by parallels with later Mesopotamian religion, in which serpent-like deities and hybrid human-animal figures appear repeatedly. They are consistent with what we know about the ritual life of early agricultural societies. They place the figurines, sensibly, within the broader context of Near Eastern religious art, and yet the figurines themselves continue to provoke other readings. Some researchers working at the edges of accepted scholarship have noted the resemblance between the Ubaid figurines and the modern iconography of so-called reptilian extraterrestrials, beings often described in fringe literature as a species of intelligent humanoid reptiles, said to have visited or interbred with humanity in the deep past. The features of the figurines, the elongated skulls, the slit eyes, the lipless mouths, bear an uncomfortable resemblance to these descriptions. Whether this resemblance is meaningful or coincidental is, of course, debated. The mainstream view holds that the resemblance is purely accidental, that modern fringe iconography has unconsciously borrowed from ancient artifacts like these, creating a circular impression of correspondence where none originally existed. Others have pointed to the elongated skulls of the figurines and connected them to the broader pattern of artificially elongated skulls found in archaeological sites around the world, from ancient Peru to ancient Egypt, from the Caucasus to certain regions of Mesopotamia itself. The practice of cranial deformation, in which the skulls of infants were deliberately bound or shaped to produce an elongated form, was widespread in many ancient cultures. Some have suggested that the Ubaid figurines may depict elite individuals whose skulls were modified in this way, that the elongated heads are not reptilian at all, but represent the physical appearance of priests or rulers who underwent cranial reshaping as a marker of their status. The ridges and points on some of the figurines in this reading would be exaggerated representations of bound and reshaped human skulls. This too is a possibility. It connects the figurines to a documented practice in the ancient world. It offers a naturalistic explanation for what would otherwise seem inexplicable, but it does not entirely resolve the strangeness of the faces. The eyes are still slit. The mouths are still lipless. The expressions are still, somehow, not quite right. And then there are the deeper questions. Why these figures, in this place, at this time? The Ubaid culture produced enormous quantities of pottery, of architecture, of decorative art, most of it depicting plants, geometric patterns, abstract designs. Representations of human beings are relatively rare in their material record, and among those representations, the lizard-headed figurines stand apart. They are not the only style of human figure produced by the Ubaid, but they are the most arresting. They are the ones that have drawn attention for 100 years and more. They are the ones that, when displayed in museum cases in Baghdad, in London, in Berlin, cause visitors to stop, lean forward, and look more closely than they had intended to. What were they? The figurines lie now in their cases, lit softly. Some are intact. Some are broken, heads severed from bodies, arms missing, infants separated from their mothers. They have lain in the earth for nearly 7,000 years, accompanying the dead of a people whose names we do not know, in graves dug along the banks of rivers that have shifted course many times since then. If they were gods, what did the Ubaid believe their gods looked like? If they were rulers, what did the rulers do to themselves to come to look this way? If they were memories, of someone or something that the Ubaid people had once seen. What was it? And how, after 7,000 years, are we to know the difference? Faces from before history, eyes that look out from clay older than writing itself. The deep past sometimes leaves us with objects we can hold in our hands. Physical things, made by physical hands, surviving across millennia. But there is another kind of mystery, harder to grasp, more troubling in its way. The mystery that exists not in stone or bronze or fired clay, but in words, in stories repeated across centuries, written down by serious people in serious texts, describing a thing that, if it ever existed, has now vanished entirely, leaving behind only the legend, and the question of whether the legend was ever true. Travel west from the marshes of southern Iraq, across the deserts of the Levant, into the rolling hill country at the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, to the land stretching south from Lebanon and Syria, through Palestine, toward the borders of Egypt. Here in the 10th century BC, according to the religious traditions of three of the world's great faiths, a king named Solomon ruled over a kingdom centered on the city of Jerusalem. He was the son of David. He was, the texts tell us, the wisest man who ever lived. He spoke with animals. He commanded demons. He composed proverbs and songs by the thousands. And under his reign the great temple of Jerusalem was built, a structure of such beauty and significance that, 3,000 years later, its memory still shapes the religious imagination of half the world. The temple, according to the accounts preserved in the Hebrew scriptures, was an enormous and elaborate structure. It was built of cedar from Lebanon, of gold from Ophir, of finely cut stone quarried from the hills around Jerusalem. It contained a great altar, vast courtyards, intricate decorations of carved wood and beaten metal. Its construction, according to the first book of Kings, took 7 years. And the workmanship, the chronicler notes carefully, was carried out under a peculiar condition. No iron tools were used. The text states it plainly. The stones for the temple were prepared at the quarry, so that no hammer or chisel or any iron tool was heard at the building site while it was being built. The injunction is repeated in different forms across several biblical passages. Iron somehow was forbidden in the construction of the temple. The stones were to be shaped, fitted, and joined by some other means. What means exactly the canonical scriptures do not say, but the rabbinic tradition does, and what it says is one of the strangest things in the entire body of ancient Near Eastern legend. In the Talmud and in various midrashic texts compiled across the early centuries of the Common Era, the rabbis preserved an account of how Solomon's masons accomplished their task without iron. They did not use chisels. They did not use hammers. They did not, according to the tradition, use any conventional tool at all. Instead, they used a substance called the shamir. The descriptions are specific. The shamir was a small object, variously described as a worm, a stone, or some hybrid of the two, about the size of a grain of barley in some accounts, possessed of a power that bordered on the inexplicable. When applied to stone, the shamir would split the stone wherever it touched. When applied to iron, it would cleave the iron. When applied to the hardest substances known to the ancient world, diamonds, granite, the densest metals, the shamir would cut through them as if they were soft wood. It could not be held in any ordinary container. The shamir, the rabbis explain, was so potent that it would destroy any vessel made of metal or stone. It had to be wrapped in tufts of wool, packed in a lead box filled with barley bran, and kept carefully sealed when not in use. The origin of the shamir in the tradition is itself remarkable. It was, the texts say, one of the 10 things created by God at twilight on the 6th day of creation, in the final moments before the first Sabbath. A small group of unique objects whose existence stood outside the ordinary order of nature. It had been used in earlier generations to engrave the names of the 12 tribes onto the gemstones of the high priest's breastplate. By Solomon's time, however, the shamir had been hidden away in a remote place, guarded by a great bird, sometimes called the hoopoe, sometimes a moorhen, far from any human reach. How Solomon obtained the shamir is itself a story. According to the tradition, the king summoned the demon Asmodeus and compelled him, by the power of his magical signet ring, to reveal where the shamir was kept. Asmodeus directed Solomon's servants to the bird that guarded it. The servants, by a clever trick involving covered nests and broken glass, persuaded the bird to bring the shamir from its hiding place. They seized it. They brought it back to Jerusalem, and with it, the masons of the temple shaped the stones, silently without hammer or chisel, into the perfect, gleaming forms that would constitute the holiest building in the ancient world. What are we to make of this? The mainstream scholarly position is unambiguous. The shamir, in this view, is mythological. The biblical injunction against iron tools in the temple's construction is read as a religious or symbolic prohibition, perhaps reflecting an ancient association between iron and warfare, perhaps expressing a broader spiritual ideal that the holiest of buildings should not be touched by the implements of human violence. The rabbinic elaborations on this reading are folk explanations, stories told to account for a scriptural mystery, embellished over generations, taking on a life of their own. The shamir is no more historically real than the demon Asmodeus, or the magical signet ring with which Solomon controlled him. It belongs to the world of religious imagination, not to the world of archaeology. This is the cautious view. It is supported by the lack of any physical evidence for the shamir, by the manifestly legendary character of the surrounding narratives, and by the way the stories about the substance grow more elaborate as one moves from earlier to later sources, a typical pattern for the development of folklore. And yet, even for those who accept this conclusion, certain questions linger. The injunction against iron is unusual. Other ancient temples, in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in Greece, were built with whatever tools were available, and no parallel prohibition exists in the religious literature of those cultures. The fact that the prohibition is recorded in the Hebrew scriptures and elaborated upon in detailed practical terms suggests that something about the construction of Solomon's temple required explanation. Whether that explanation reflects a real technical anomaly or merely a religious requirement enforced by tradition is a matter of interpretation. A few researchers working at the edges of accepted scholarship have proposed that the shamir traditions may preserve, in legendary form, the memory of a real ancient technology. The descriptions are suggestive. A small object, capable of cutting the hardest stone, requiring careful containment because it would destroy ordinary materials. Some have wondered whether the legends might describe a form of acid, a corrosive substance powerful enough to dissolve rock, dangerous to handle, transported in inert containers of wool and bran. Others have suggested some form of focused energy, perhaps a primitive laser or sonic device, whose true nature was misremembered by people who lacked the conceptual framework to describe it. Still others have pointed to the precision stonework of certain ancient sites, at Sacsayhuaman, at Tiahuanaco, in the megalithic walls of pre-Inca Peru, and asked whether some lost technique of stone cutting might once have existed across multiple ancient cultures, surviving in folk memory as legends of magical tools. These are speculative readings. They are not supported by direct archaeological evidence. They depend on taking ancient legends as records of historical fact, rather than as religious or cultural narratives shaped by their own internal logic. But the legends persist, and the prohibition against iron in the construction of the temple persists with them. And the question of how exactly the masons of the 10th century BC produced the finely fitted stones described in the biblical account, without leaving behind tool marks consistent with iron implements, has not been fully answered. The temple itself, of course, was destroyed in 586 BC by the Babylonian forces of Nebuchadnezzar. Whatever stones it once contained have been lost or buried or repurposed in the long contested history of the site where it stood. The platform on which it was built remains, in modified form, in the heart of Jerusalem today. But the original masonry is gone. Whatever evidence the stones might have offered, about iron tools or their absence, about the techniques of their preparation, was destroyed 2.5 millennia ago. What remains is the story. A small object, the size of a grain of barley, wrapped in wool, kept in a lead box, capable of splitting any stone in the world, hidden once in the nest of a bird at the edge of the wilderness, brought to Jerusalem by demonic compulsion, used in absolute silence to build the most sacred structure of the ancient world. It cannot have been real. And yet it is described with such particularity, in such practical detail, that one wonders. One wonders what the ancient writers were trying to record. One wonders what they had heard or read or remembered that compelled them to write it down so carefully, as if the shamir were not merely a story, but a thing that, if it ever existed, has long since been lost. A thing whose only remaining trace is a series of rabbinical commentaries, written down centuries after Solomon, describing a technology that should not have been possible in the world they inhabited. And that question, of course, is the same question we have asked of the Antikythera mechanism, of the Baghdad battery, of the Saqqara bird and the Dendera reliefs, of every artifact in this long catalog of objects that should not exist. What if the shamir was real? And if it was, what else has been lost?